Why don't we get this show on the road? Let me drop the link in as usual and a list of references, and then we'll do our spiel for the recording for the folks who are new or who are returning after a while. So, my goodness, this is the 182nd week of the Kenneth Smith seminar, Millennia and Microcosm. And we're going through medieval civilization, and we're still in chapter 9, and we're about to start paragraph 5, which we haven't done yet. The link to the text is there. But as is our wont for the current year in medieval civilization, we don't start with Kenneth Smith, we finish with Kenneth Smith. We start with original sources. And so we'll be focusing on that. Some of the references that we'll be using are in the links. There's Burton Mack's book, Who Wrote the New Testament, which is an attempt to bring all of us up to date with where biblical scholarship is, not with Burton Mack's own personal theories, but kind of what is the consensus today of what do most biblical scholars sort of, understand to be the shared understanding about these books, and what's in each one and who wrote it and so forth. We also use the website Early Christian Writings, which is a great resource. It lists every early Christian work that we either have or don't have but know about, whether it's because somebody quoted it but now it's lost, or somebody just referenced it and described it a little bit. There are a lot of books like that. We have no text of them, but we know they were there because people who we trust talk about them a little bit and say, and in some cases, we know part of their contents because they would quote some of them, whether to agree or disagree. So it's a very useful resource. And I guess we could put that with what Michaela was sharing with us earlier, the Christian Classics Ethereal Library, ccl.org, which is another resource for Christian mystical writings. Over the next year, we'll be going through so many of them. Some of which are stacked right here, yeah, but we'll go on. So we'll also be looking at the Wikipedia article on 1 Thessalonians. As with any Wikipedia article, it is a mix of things that you can trust reasonably well and things you really shouldn't trust as far as you can throw them. And we're going to talk about the differences between those today. There's also the Wikipedia article on the authorship of the epistles, the letters that are attributed to Paul. That's a major topic we'll be talking about today. And then finally, I want to point you all at another book, The Authentic Letters of Paul, a new reading of Paul's rhetoric and meaning. This is by Arthur Dewey, Roy Hoover, Lane McGovey, and Daryl Schmidt. They are four of the members of the Jesus Seminar that ran from the 1980s through the 1990s, where they got like 100 of the world's greatest biblical scholars, and they put them in a committee together and said, we want you to go through the whole damn thing and tell us which of this looks authentic and which of it doesn't, according to, current standards of scholarship. And they spent all that time working on it, and then in the decades since, they've been slowly putting out translations for the rest of us to read. And this is their one on Paul's letters. It's a valuable resource. What they have in there is it's called the Scholar's Version translation of Paul's epistles, and they note anything that somebody has questioned as maybe not authentic. The things that everyone agrees is not authentic, they actually pull out into a separate section. Where there are epistles like Philippians that are actually composites of several different letters, they have attempted to distinguish the letters from each other and put them into order as best we can figure out chronologically. So they're really, and they have a lot of footnotes and essays to go with. What are the main problems with this letter or that letter? What are the questions that are open, and so forth? It's if you're interested in the letters of Paul, it's on the short list of books you ought to have at hand. And it includes complete translations, basically. What is the best that they could do to try to translate Paul using modern scholarship and using the best available manuscripts. It's a resource that we'll be using in the months ahead as we work our way through the seven epistles attributed to Paul that are most widely deemed authentic. We did Thessalonians last time. We're going to do Thessalonians again this week because there's more to say about it than I said last time. Stephen, come off mute. Oh, you're not on mute. Just tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, yes, I was just wondering, Rick, since you've spent a bit of time with this, what's your impression, how does, Christianity and its early leader, Paul, uh, compare to all the other crazy fringe groups you've come across? Let's say, how does it compare with Scientology?
What a broad question, Stephen. Isn't there a book or two or 12 to be written on as an answer to that question? That's awfully complicated. I mean, one thing that we can say is Christianity in the year 50, which is where we're at the moment in our walkthrough together, appears to be several dozen different religions all existing side
I'm a
by side.
sophisticated Roman scholar walking through the streets, and I go, "Who are these guys? Oh, they're just another crazy fringe group." That's
Exactly.
probably be the answer.
Well, and Thessalonians is an interesting one to look at in that regard because, as Burton Mack and these Jesus Seminar guys say, one of the most important things there's two incredibly important things about it. One is it is the earliest non-anonymous piece of text that we actually have. That's Christian. It is it's claims to be written by Paul, and as far as we can tell, it is written by Paul. So right off the bat, that separates it from a lot of other things. It's not something that we had to infer by reading between the lines of Luke and Matthew. So that puts it ahead of the book of Q. I mean, it's actually a document. We have very early examples of it. I think somewhere around 200 is the earliest papyrus fragment we have. And you can look at the papyrus and actually see in the Greek that these are lines from Thessalonians. So we know this thing is real. This is a real document from the real time. That's important. The other thing that's really important about Thessalonians is it is we take it for granted because it's in the canon, but we really shouldn't because it has something astonishing in it. And the thing that it has that is astonishing is evidently Paul was able to go to a city, Thessalonica, which was largely Gentile. It was cosmopolitan, people from all over the world. And he was able to, we're not talking about Jews, we're talking about non-Jews. He was able to share his message with them, and they bought it. He was persuading Gentiles right off the bat, really early on. And these are not backwater Gentiles. These are not uneducated Gentiles. Thessalonica was where Pompey set up his base of operations during the Civil War during Roman times. This is a highly wealthy, educated city with people from all over the world. And they're not responding to Paul by going, what a nutter, which is what we'd expect, right? We'd expect, like,
Hang on. You mean it's a city like New York or
yeah,
Los Angeles or
yeah,
something like that? That's a recommendation.
yeah. Well, the thing that's surprising about it is that it's one thing to think of Christianity as arising as a Jewish sect that some Jews but not others might like. But it's something else to think, no, he's just walking out in the middle of a bunch of Gentiles and preaching to them, and they're going, okay, we're on board, we buy it. And, part of what's in Thessalonians is his delight that when he sends Timothy back, they haven't all immediately, turned back into Gentiles the moment he turned his back. They still buy it even without him being there. And he spends a certain number of paragraphs going, "Wow, okay then. So you're still with me. That's really interesting."
We wouldn't know though, what Thessalonica was like exactly, because when we think Greco-Roman, and this
Yeah.
is what Nietzsche warned us about, we have these grand visions of this, pristine, sort of pure society.
Yes,
There's no camel dung in our vision.
that's right. That's right.
And, I'd imagine a big city, it's like, relatively speaking, there's going to be a lot of complexities there. There's going to be an element, a division in society, people forming, different social groups. I mean, he's not coming into a place which is like one big united family.
No, no. No, you're right. I mean, we're talking about people who've been displaced from all over Asia and Europe and Africa, kind of rubbing shoulders. Um, if we're looking for just a gut feel of what it's like, you can't go wrong with the HBO series Rome. I mean, they modeled the look and feel of Rome not on the stark Roman ruins the way they come down to us, but on I can't remember, was it Bombay, someplace in India, and where there's color everywhere. There's graffiti everywhere. There's, people speaking different languages, passing each other in the streets. There's people who know just a smidge of another language, enough to order a
And a lot of
beer.
wonderful polytheistic gods as well.
Yes. Yes.
It's got everything.
Yes. It was one of the painters in the late 19th century in the pre-Raphaelite movement. I think it was uh, Alta Tadema, who actually went to ancient Greek and Roman ruins and got up into the corners, where nobody had been in 1,000 years, and he found traces of the old bright paints on the tops of the pillars and on the buildings. And that was the big breakthrough that proved to us that they were all brilliantly colorful. All these things. It was nothing like we imagined. It wasn't a bunch of sober people in togas pontificating quietly to one another. It was chaos. It was, it was a crazy, lively city, like you're saying, Stephen. And that means, yeah, ox poop in the streets, people yelling at each other across an alley. I mean, it was, that's the kind of place he went to.
Well,
Uh,
it's like our society. There'd be a lot of people who are disaffected. This was a world in which the traditional culture. Now, you've made the great claim, along with Kenneth Smith, of the ancient temple culture was supplanted by this new Greek culture, which
yes.
concentrated much more on the civic aspect rather than just having the temple as the absolute center of everything,
Yes, that's right.
apparently.
That's right. A massive transformation in society that really Alexander the Great imposed on everybody when he went everywhere and smashed all these temple states.
So
There's a
there's going to
map.
be a lot of people who might be very open to something new coming along.
Exactly. Exactly. So I just pasted into the chat an image taken from the Jesus Seminar book, The Authentic Letters of Paul. It gives a map of where Thessalonica is. It's probably helpful to know. That road that goes up from Corinth and Athens through Thessalonica to Philippi and then off to the right, that's the road that goes to the Bosporus where Constantinople is, and or Byzantium at this point, I think, and where the Silk Road basically from Asia Minor crosses the strait and then it runs through Philippi and Thessalonica and branches out elsewhere into Europe, including down into Greece. So you can see that Thessalonica is an important crossroads on the kind of European, where the Silk Road has splintered and is entering Europe. So this really reinforces why somebody like Pompey would set up his base of operations there. There's a lot of wealth, there's a lot of cosmopolitanism. You can get to a lot of places from here. And considering that where Paul came from was Syria, off to the east across the Bosporus. In fact, all the way, you have to travel all the way through Asia Minor to get down into Syria. The man is traveling a lot, considering that actual Roman maps of the world at this point are just shockingly primitive. I spent some time this morning looking at some Roman maps from around this era, and wow, are they strange. For one thing, east is up, and the shapes of the continents are wildly distorted. Weirdly, even the shape of Italy is wildly distorted. I mean, obviously they know it's a peninsula, but it doesn't look like a boot. And for all of us who recognize it visually as a boot, it's shocking that the Italians themselves didn't recognize it as a boot on their maps. They never got in a plane and flew up into the air. They never were in space looking down. They didn't know. They just knew it stuck out into the Mediterranean. So, people with maps that primitive are still traveling across vast distances. They've got a different way of thinking about the world and interacting with the world, and they're not scared of it. Somebody like Paul's traveling such a long distance. Michaela, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. I can see you got your hand up.
Oh, there's so many juicy things I want to dive into. Oh, even based like I had just one thought, and then like you just started and like on Stevens, but so let me go backwards and then I'll arrive at my first thought. But what you had just said, like I mean, just it must have been so that they were so comfortable living in the world in the time period that they lived in, and we're not even scarcely aware of what that was like for them because of our modern world and our modern little conveniences and our little smartphones and our little fucking gadgets. Like, like you could literally walk away from a person like back in the day, and that would have been the last time you would have ever seen them without GPS. And like, how did even Paul ever find Timothy again? How does his epistles even get to Timothy? How did his letters even get to Timothy? Like somebody had to actually carry them all the way with a little map. I mean, like, seriously? I mean, really? Like, what are we to believe here? What is going on? And then what else? What did I want to say? So yeah, oh yeah. The two things about what Stephen had said. Also, just to bring it more clearer and home. What is like because obviously maybe back in the day, I mean, because even still today, the religiously and spiritually minded and those into spiritual things and spiritism and conspiracy theories and UFO and ET believers and stuff like that outnumber atheists and and secularists alike by far. But still, in all, but yet, in all, back in the day, like maybe spiritual beliefs were more common even today. But like, what's the reasonableness that somebody would have been more likely to jump on the Christian bandwagon back in the day as opposed to today? And like, and then even with that in mind, you have to forgive me, I'm a little tired. I'm getting over a cold. But then also, wasn't it in the book of Thessalonians, where I'm thinking maybe Ephesians, where at one of the pavilions for philosophers, where Paul said, is it not into this unknown, this God that I speak to you of, that is written, that has an inscription here in stone, to the unknown God. In him we live, move, and have our being. And there is a story in a book that a professor of mine in seminary told me to pick up. And it was called, the book that is Charismatic Seminary. And he told me to pick this book up. It's called They Speak in Other Tongues. They Speak in Other Tongue with Other Tongues. And in this book, this author shared a story that he had, and he quoted, he cited the source, and it was an ancient source because I looked it up, and I saw the citation and everything, and it said that there is this in some ancient time in Greece or Rome, no Greece, there was this plague that was spreading across the land. And the oracles said, you must seek out a wise man, and he'll be on such and such this island. So they went to this island. They sought this wise man out. He'll know what to do. And I know I'm going too long. I'm sorry, Rick.
No, this is interesting. Keep going.
Yeah. So this wise man, this oracle said he'll know what to do. He'll know, and he'll cure the plague. And so the wise man said, this unknown God has, no matter what you, and they did all these sacrifices to it. They sacrificed bulls, doves, goats, sheep, whatever, right? So this wise man said, you got to find a lamb, a spotless, blemishless lamb, and to watch it for 3 days to make sure that no bones are broken. Look at it, survey it, no bones are broken. 3 days, and on the third day sacrifice it and burn it on a pyre, and the plague will end. And it did, in record. And this guy said that was a reference to Christ. Just an interesting story. So which book does Paul make that statement, Rick?
I don't know. We're going through them right now from the beginning, and First
Yeah.
Thessalonians is the first of our Paul letters. But over the weeks ahead, we're going to go through the rest of them, and we'll see where it crops up. But
Yeah.
the point you're making really reinforces the idea that atheism was not a normal perspective in the ancient world. It really wasn't. Even Epicurus, the Roman philosopher of hedonism, or Epicureanism more specifically, who was famously an atheist. When you read his explanation for why he's an atheist, you conclude, I'm not sure that even is atheism. He says the reason he's an atheist is because Epicureanism is about how to be calm and happy. And if he's worried all the time about what the gods want from him, then he can't be calm and he can't be happy. So he's decided to pretend they're not there.
Yes.
Now
I
that's
can't
very
remember.
different from genuinely thinking they're not there.
Yeah.
That's just saying I don't want to listen to my mom. My mom is telling me to do my chores and it troubles me and I don't want to feel troubled.
And
So I'm just going to plug my ears.
couldn't you, if you were an atheist, like, couldn't you do the reverse if you're an atheist? Like, play your cards like God or the gods do exist. So you're actually playing at Pascal's wager.
Exactly.
What atheists would actually do that? Because all atheists absolutely abhor Pascal's wager. But like, but you could actually do the reverse and be an atheist and play in the God game and say, well, I'm going to follow God's laws because if I do, I might get mercy or grace.
Right. Right. So, the point you're making is that the era we're in, atheism is not typical, and even where it occurs, it's not atheism as we would recognize it. In fact, part of what I like about this book, this the authentic letters of Paul, is it gives us a lot of background. I'm going to quote a little bit of it right now that's highly relevant. Who is it that Paul converted? Okay, so this is a paragraph. I've split it in two just because of the length restrictions of the chat. Um, they write, the religious landscape of Thessalonica in Paul's time was a mixture of ancient Greek fertility gods like Dionysus, Aphrodite, and Demeter, and more recent redeemer gods associated with the mystery religions. The remains of a Serapeum, a temple of the Egyptian god Serapis, who was equated with Asclepius, who saved one from illnesses, have been discovered to the west of the city center. Coins from the end of the first century CE suggest that the Phrygian cult of the Kabiri, or twin gods, who are like Castor and Polydeuces, or Castor and Pollux in Roman, the sons of Tyndareus, who were treated as gods and referred to by the Greeks as the great gods. This is what Gemini in astrology is based on, is Castor and Polydeuces, who were very important religious figures, and not just generally, but literally in Thessalonica they had a temple to a Kabirium. So that was strong in Thessalonica. The Phrygians merged the two into a single god with two faces, like Janus. They called Kabirus, and so there is a temple of the Kabiri that is on the island of Samothrace, close to Thessalonica, and that cult would have been very active in Thessaloniki. They write, the confluence of Greek fertility deities and Asian redeemer gods in Thessalonica generated a notion of individual salvation from the misfortunes of this life and the promise of an afterlife freed from eternal punishment or endless reincarnations. That was part of the religious culture of Thessalonica before Paul even got there. That's the kinds of things people were thinking about. And then they finish up, whether Paul's message offered the same hope of salvation in the afterlife for a community member who died before the arrival of the parousia, Jesus' return, as that promised in the Thessalonian mysteries, seems to lie behind the concern Paul addresses in 4:13 through 17. So part of what the Thessalonians are worrying about after Paul leaves, when Timothy goes and visits them, is, well, we spent our whole lives immersed in these various religions that are talking about the afterlife and how we're going to get to spend time with our dead, who will be alive then and we'll be with them. But you didn't say anything about that, Paul, when you came and preached to us. And so now we're wondering, after we die, are we going to be resurrected? And if we are resurrected, are we going to be without our beloved ancestors? Or are they going to be resurrected with us? Who all is going to be there? And Paul has to deal with that at Thessalonians. And last time we just talked about it as though this was something that happened to have come up, that the Thessalonians happened to be worried about because of the general Greco-Roman culture. But as the Jesus Seminar folks point out, it's actually very specific to Thessalonica that this particular set of beliefs is widespread among these different religions that they're practicing. Now, this is one of the places we're going to talk about a priori and posteriori reasoning today. It's one of Kenneth Smith's favorites, and we're going to talk about it because of this very point. Who did Paul convert? What did they believe before Paul converted them to the new faith? Now, in Acts, it says that he converted Jews, that it was Jews in Thessalonica who Paul converted. But in Paul's own letter, Thessalonians, he doesn't say it was Jews. He says it was idol worshippers, which is what they called, worshippers of Aphrodite, Dionysus, Demeter, all of these deities that are in Thessalonica. These are the kinds of deities that you would call an idol worshiper. You would never in a million years would you call, Jews idol worshippers, especially in Paul's day. The things that Moses was concerned or Aaron was concerned about we came back home and we found people with a golden calf, the straying of the Jews, or the archaeological evidence that in the 200s BC, 300s BC, 400s BC, that there were Jews who still were polytheistic. This is gone by Paul's time. They're monotheistic. They've been monotheistic for, at least a century and a half. It's no longer just monotheistic cults on the periphery of Jewish culture. They're all monotheistic. We know from the archaeological evidence. So why does Acts say that in Thessalonica Paul converted Jews when Paul says he converted idol worshippers? And this takes us back to one of the most important points about Acts, which is no modern biblical scholar who isn't an apologist thinks that Acts can be treated as history. No one thinks you can use it as a reference to tell us what actually happened. That Acts describes mythological history. The church reinventing its own past to try to make peace between the pillars of Jerusalem and Paul's mission, when in reality they were quite separated from each other, quite different from each other, and they didn't agree. There was division among the early Christians. They had different priorities and they didn't agree with each other. But by the time Acts is being written, they don't like that. And so they're trying to rewrite their own history to make a nice, tidy story. Jesus tells his disciples, the disciples tell the apostles spread the word, bishops arise, the bishops take the authority from the apostles, and now the bishops today who are telling you what to do, you have to obey them because it's step by step, it came from Jesus. That's the mission of Acts, is to try to establish apostolic succession. And in order to try to reach that end, the community, the Lucan community that wrote Acts, is perfectly willing to stick their thumb on the scales of justice and press as hard as they have to get the answer that they want. This is not my opinion. This is the opinion of most biblical scholars. Now, there are biblical scholars who will disagree with this, but most of them are apologists. When you've been taught one thing and you believe it with all your heart, but the actual evidence in the world says something different, you're faced with a choice. And this choice is the choice that Kenneth Smith is talking about when he says, all philosophy is either escapist or existentialist. To be existentialist, you have to be willing to overturn the ideas you had ahead of time if the evidence doesn't support it. This is the basis of the scientific method. You have to be willing to say, I always thought this. For 59 years, I believed this, but I just found this new evidence I never saw before. And this evidence would be impossible if I were right, so I must be wrong. The evidence has to be able to change my mind. And modern scholars say that's what you have to do with Acts. You have to look at Acts and say, I know we all learned this in Bible school, but it's a new fiction, right? It was a new fiction to establish a new history, and that would become the foundation that Christianity would go on to going forward. So, just put it more simply, if Paul, writing at the time, says that he converted Gentiles, and some guy 40 years later says, "Nuh-uh, he was converting Jews," and the guy who said that wasn't even there at the time, who are you going to believe? The direct eyewitness reporting his own behavior, who has no particular reason to lie about this detail, or some guy later on who's really concerned about the church and is trying to rewrite history? You have to say one of these guys is historians. The art of history, a great deal of it is trying to evaluate your sources and figure out, this is one of the most important words. Who is an unreliable narrator? who's a reliable narrator and who's an unreliable narrator. You have to filter this. You have to look at the body of evidence and compare the different sources and try to work out. And as Kenneth Smith says about Aristea, it's a matter of taste. There's no calculation that's going to do this for you. There's no proof. There's no absolutely solid, God comes down from the heaven and hands you the tablets and now you know what the truth is. This is the kind of thing where you're mucking about among, multiple differing sources and trying to get a feel for which one actually sounds like Paul and which one sounds like somebody else trying to impersonate Paul or misrepresent Paul for their own purposes. I'll call on Michele in just a second, but there's one more thing I want to add. I'm going to go into a priori and a posteriori in a moment, but one of the things I want to add is in his class about Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, which David Royal attended back in the day, and I have recordings of. Kenneth Smith makes this point that Nietzsche is a philologist first, then a philosopher. And his philosophy arose from his philology. And German philologists were people who studied manuscripts. If you've got multiple manuscripts purporting to represent, one of Plato's dialogues, but they don't agree with each other, how do you figure out which one's more authentic than the other? How do you figure out which one's closer to the original Plato and which one's not? And as Kenneth Smith explains in that course, the only way to do that is to spend a long time immersed in Plato's works and to pay attention to what makes Plato different from other people. What is his voice like? What's his thinking like? What are his idioms like? What are his concerns? What does he care about? You have to get a real taste for the character of the man in order to compare two manuscripts and go, of these two manuscripts, this one sounds more like Plato. And that one sounds more like somebody writing 150 years later when everybody was worried about this other thing that Plato didn't care about at all because it hadn't happened yet. You know what I mean? Looking for the different voices and separating them from each other is the job of a philologist. And it's ultimately, although the word philologist makes you think it's someone who studies words, what it actually is it's someone who studies character. And they're trying to be able to distinguish the character of, say, Paul, who is not a misogynist in any of the authentic letters, from the concerns of people in the second century when patriarchy is on the rise in the Christian church and they're trying to suppress all these women mystics and they're writing letter after letter. They're interpolating, saying women should shut up, women should just do what men say, men should make me a sandwich. There's a lot of that stuff coming out of the second century. And when you see a line like that in the middle of Paul, a philologist goes, that is not the character of Paul. That's the character of these other guys writing 100 years later. They were really concerned about that, but Paul wasn't concerned about that. So I don't think that's Paul. That sifting process, that's philology. And because it goes to character, that focus on character is a focus on nature, which is ultimately what leads to, the spirit of a philosopher and thus Nietzsche's entire body of work. So that's what's going on when we compare what Acts says Paul did to what Paul says Paul did. You know, we're trying to understand the differing characters and their differing motivations and concerns so that we can figure out who's been tampering and which parts are original. Michele, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay. Well, no one else is speaking except for me and you, Rick, except Stephen. You did have a great question in the beginning, and I loved it, buddy. Loved it.
They will.
Huh?
They will. I know them well. They're just winding up.
Yeah. So here's a couple of different things I want to hit you with, Rick, and get your opinion, and maybe Stephen and Ginny can chime in on this. About the treatment of women and authorship coming directly from Paul. Well, we know that a good writer, a good author, can change and will shift and change their voice that they're writing in to fit who they're writing to, the audience they're writing to. And you can do that in one book, you can do that in one letter, you can shift voices, or dramatic effect, or tone. You can do it to get a thought across, or something you want to add some spice, or something a little different. But one of the reasons I think Paul gets and I'm not saying Acts was, or any of the stuff that was written, that was said, women ought to make me just a sandwich and stay quiet in the pews and that kind of, and not wear makeup and dress plainly and not speak unless told to by a man or given permission by a man. I'm not saying Paul wrote that. I mean, it's possible that he could have, but if he did, I think he wrote it because he knew that if women were seen as leaders in the church, that they would be directly targeted by the Romans for slaughter, and the church would become a more powerful organization because they'd not only have men preaching, but they'd also have women as well with aid and help. And obviously everyone in this group is we're all well educated. Maybe not me, I'm just a fucking dummy. But like, so anyway, to say that these gospels and these books were written by bronze age goat herding dullards is a horrible thing to say, because the Jews were well educated people. Pretty much all of them could read. One of the reasons the Romans probably feared them. And but there is something I would like to bring up maybe later on in the group about, like you mentioned, idols and that sort of thing, Rick. But like idols, and I don't know if you've gotten into the book of Enoch or any of the extra canonical gospels, and if we will get into those. But the book of Enoch, talking about the Watchers, and then some of the extra canonical books talking about the fallen angels and the Nephilim, or Nephilim. There are, any Jew of that time or ancient times would have known if the book was talking about, if the word idol, there's an idol, there's a god associated with a stone or wooden idol. And that God, the ancient Jews would have believed at the very least that God exists. So
Yeah,
the first commandment, when it says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," they may have very well taken that to mean, "Thou shalt not that thou shalt not believe in any other gods for me." For even for the book says Satan is the god of Hasatan is the god of this world, and bewile of the devil's wearies, lest you not get trapped up by him. But like, so maybe these other gods exist that have idols dedicated to them, and that's what the ancient Jews believe. Maybe that's just my point.
Thanks, Mikaela. Yeah, we went through a bit the history of ancient Judaism, and one of the things we talked about is how there were stages where they were polytheistic, there were stages where they were monolatrists, which is an interesting difference from monotheism. There's another state. So one of the states, let me just, rather than the terms, let me just talk about some of the categories. So one of the categories is what you're describing. There are many gods, but this is the God we do first. This is our God, right? That he's at the front of the list. He's always first. Then there's one greater God, and all the other gods are just his angels or servants. And that's a different kind of, that's all. So in modern English, we lump all these things together as the same thing, but they're really not, and they're different stages of the Jewish religion. Another one that the Jews in particular give an example of is, there's plenty of gods in the world, but we don't care. This is our God. It's not that we don't think the others are there. Those are the gods of other people. If you're living in the Persian temple state, then you should have the Persian God. If you're living in the Babylonian temple state, you should have the Babylonian God. But we're the Jews, so we have the Jewish God. And this is also one of the many variations on what we might mean in English when we use the vague arm wavy term monotheism. And interestingly, the Jews appear to have gone through all of these different stages on their way to complete monotheism. It's fascinating. And Jewish scholars, rabbis, rabbinical scholars are much clearer about this than most modern Christians are, because they have this gigantic, collection of documented debates about the meaning of the Torah. That is every bit the Talmud, every bit as important to them. They read the Talmud extensively, and so all of the past debates and discussions about what does it mean when we say no other gods before me? What are the possible ways to interpret that? They've got all that stuff in the Talmud, and they acknowledge that their religion went through transformations. It's modern Christians who kind of, especially literalists, who want it all to be true at the same time, who kind of destroy the reality in their own minds that the Tanakh is a history, and that the covenants change over time, and that what you're supposed to do changes over time. And the Tanakh even has different rules for the priests than it does for everybody else. So trying to flatten it all the way, modern literalists do, and say it all applies all the time everywhere, is just to create a bunch of contradictions the Jews themselves never would have believed, right? They would have said the old covenant is gone, the new covenant is in, or our covenant is this, but the priests have a different covenant. They could handle that level of distinction in a way that we often can't. The bit about idol worshippers, this translation, this is the scholar's version from the Jesus seminar. This is 1 Thessalonians 9. These were, sorry, 1 Thessalonians 1:9. I omitted the one and the colon here. 1:9. These reports about you demonstrate how effective our stay was among you, how you have turned away from lifeless images. That's what some of the others translate as idols. They put idols in that word. These guys say lifeless images in order to serve the living and real God, and to wait for God's Son from heaven, whom God raised from among the dead, Jesus, who will rescue us from the condemnation that is sure to come. So Paul himself is saying that the people he converted weren't Jews, and Acts says they were. So this is among about 7 dozen reasons why modern biblical scholars treat Acts as mythological history, not as a reliable source for actual history. It contradicts Paul over and over and over and over, and it contradicts geography that we know, and it contradicts archaeology that we have, and it's like the story of Theseus journeying to Athens and fighting Procrustes along the way. It's good to learn it. It's good to know it. It's good to know there are a lot of people who believed it, but you wouldn't want to actually think there was a real dude named Theseus, and he actually met a real dude named Procrustes, and things went down the way that the myth says. It's mythological history. It's about meaning and values, not about what actually happened. So, all right, so far so good. So, what is this? Biblical scholarship. If you look at the Wikipedia article, especially, I put the link in. If you look at the article on the authorship of the Pauline epistles, you'll see that scholars don't entirely agree about which epistles, letters, are probably Paul and which ones aren't. And the Wikipedia article, because it can be edited by everybody in the world, has to walk a tightrope of not so aggravating the reader that the reader will immediately hit the edit button tab and go in and start mucking about with it to change it to agree with himself. How do you keep this article from turning into just a tug of war that changes every minute? It's like one guy says, I don't believe any of the letters are authentic, and he goes in and rewrites the whole thing to say it's totally not authentic. Next guy comes along, he's a true believer. He thinks they're all authentic. He rewrites the previous guy's thing to say, no, they're all authentic. You have to believe everything. And this article is trying to tiptoe its way through all these different opposing forces, trying to avoid pissing anybody off so much that they immediately hit the edit button. And as a result, you can't rely on it to tell you what the current consensus is among scholars, because the current consensus among scholars is going to horrify and aggravate certain of the readers. And Wikipedia doesn't want the article to make them hit that edit button every time they read it. So an example of that is that there are, let's see. Yeah, we'll come back to that. So an example of that is the question of, how widespread is the consensus about what is or is not an authentic Pauline letter? And I'm going to take us through that. I should have done this before I did Thessalonians last time, but we kind of want to look at kind of where is the agreement and where is the disagreement? Which ones do we think actually represent the voice of somebody writing in 50, 51, 52, and which ones probably don't? It's probably somebody writing 100 years later, or 70 years later, or 60 years later, writing about things that Paul didn't live to see and pretending that Paul did. So I spent some time prepping. Let me share some of this stuff. And you can check the article, and you can check a copy for yourself of the Authentic Letters of Paul by those four Jesus scholarship authors. It's a great book to have. You can get it in ebook form. You could check Burton Max, Who Wrote the New Testament. You compare a bunch of these things and also early Christian writings, and you'll gradually begin to see there are parts of this that a lot of scholars agree on. So so here we go. The first thing to know is that there is a collection of four letters that basically almost nobody doubts. Now, I'll explain the caveat in a moment. This collection is called the Hauptbriefe, and the Hauptbriefe, German term, is a collection of four letters that at the University of Tübingen in Germany in the 1840s, German scholar Ferdinand Christian Bauer and the team that he led took everything that they learned about studying Roman and Greek and Egyptian and Coptic and you name it, manuscripts over the previous centuries, and they applied it to the New Testament manuscripts. That's all that the revolutionary, terrifying thing that they did is they applied the science that they applied to that people used to apply to everything but the Bible. They said, well, why not apply it to our Bible manuscripts as well? I mean, it's science, right? And it's been working for us. So why don't we question our canon and see, if it's been tampered with? And of course, the answer that they came to is, oh my God, it not only has it been tampered with, it's obviously been tampered with. And at the time they said this, of course, various people were like, how dare you? Our sacred canon cannot possibly have a single jot or tittle out of place. It's absolutely correct. And then, of course, all these guys had to do was hold up side by side translations of, well, here's the King James Bible, here's this other Bible, and look, they completely disagree about what Paul said and about what Luke said, and how can they both be true? I mean, this, if anything, needs a bunch of German philologists to come along and try to sort out the authentic author's message from what we have today. It's the Bible. I mean, don't we care if it's been tampered with? Don't we care where it's been tampered with? Don't we want to know what Jesus really said? These guys were, pretty gung ho in their motivation that the science ought to be applied to the Bible so that we can, clear out the nonsense from they want to know what Jesus said. And they want to know what Paul said. And so they concluded that Galatians and Romans and both Corinthians pretty much, no matter how deeply their analysis went, it looked to them like these are pretty clearly the same voice. And it's probably Paul. And it says it's Paul. And they say, so we don't have any reason to doubt it. And in all the time since then, although there have been a handful of scholars who have attempted to take it further than this, almost every scholar agrees that this core of four letters is definitely Paul. There's just no question. Um, yeah, I've read some of the books by the others who say no. And, you know, it's useful reading just to know what sort of thinking gets you to think that there weren't any, and maybe not even a real Paul. But the dominant collection of serious, respectable scholars wouldn't agree that these are not authentic. These seem to be authentic. Now, after Bauer and his group, another group of scholars inspired by them took the analysis further, and they concluded that Bauer and his group were right about the four, but they were wrong about three others that they think are also probably authentic. That's 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon. And they said the concerns that Bauer and their group have about these three are pretty weak compared to the concerns that Bauer and his group have about the rest of them. And so together, those four in the Hauptbriefe plus these three make up the core of seven that almost every biblical scholar today, with a handful of exceptions, almost every biblical scholar today says these are Paul's seven letters. They say they also say Paul wrote more letters. We know he wrote more letters. And one of the ways that we know that is some of these, like Philippians, aren't one letter. Somebody has pasted them together. It's a bunch of fragments of other letters that they had. and they preserve them because it's Paul. It's authentically Paul. It's Paul's voice. It's Paul's concerns. We know it's Paul, but maybe they lost part of the old letters and they didn't want to throw away what they had left, and so they put them together into Philippians, and and it's a legitimate thing to do. So it's not forgery. It's not pseudo-epigrapha. It's none of those things. It's just how do you? It's what a curator does at a museum. Yeah, this bull is broken, but it's a precious bull from a time when we don't have much. So if this is what we've got, then we're going to put it in a glass case and take care of it as best we can. And so, that's how they treat that. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah. I'm just going to say, be wary of rhetoric. If you doubt Luke on, Thessalonica, we don't know. Maybe that it was actually Thessalonians that was rewritten. Maybe it always was Jews that he went to see. But when you start to add things like Acts contradicts geography. I mean, you're sort of adding stuff in. You're starting with one argument, and you're getting into the emotional rhetoric and saying, well, it's all this other stuff as well. And I don't know really where Acts would contradict geography. I don't know about that one, but anyway, Rick, I'm curious. I know you're sort of going into this matter, but you're going to bring up an interesting question of a priori knowledge.
That's where we're going.
But will we get there today?
We'll get there today.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, this won't take long to get through. I'm just giving us an overview of the letters attributed to Paul and kind of what do scholars in general say about them. We're not going to go into the details about it because we're going to save that for each of the letters. Each of the authentic 7 letters is going to get its week or possibly in the case of Corinthians, we might take more than one so that we can actually understand. Because what we're trying to do in all of this is we're trying to hear from early Christians, right? Kenneth Smith is giving us his picture of the medieval era, and his picture is focused on what was the dominant religious empire. What did it think Jesus represented and Christianity? What was it selling as its version of Christianity? But as we said early on, the medieval era is not defined solely by that dominant power group, because it's also defined by all of these mystics and nuns and monks who were inspired by the Desert Mothers and Fathers, who were inspired by Jesus, who were inspired by Paul. And they often wrote things that were very in disagreement with the dominant religious empire's position. And even the dominant religious empire split, right, between the Eastern and the Western church, and they didn't agree with each other. So in order to represent the medieval worldview, we have to do justice to the different perspectives of these different groups. And we have to recognize that when someone like Joan of Arc, an illiterate peasant in the backwaters of France, was able to persuade the entire countryside and professional soldiers, hard-headed, not falling for anybody's crap, professional soldiers were following this peasant girl into battle. And you're like, what is happening right now? How can this possibly be occurring? It's not because of the dominant Orthodox religious empire's version of the theology. It's because of the spiritual stuff. It's this stuff about how do you get back to the spirit of Jesus and the brotherhood of man that he was, and the his version of the ending of the corrupt world and its replacement with a better world. All of that stuff that is sort of excluded from the dominant religious empire's version of theology is still so powerful in the Middle Ages that it can organize great masses of people to throw out the English army at a time when France was otherwise losing all of its battles. It's astonishing the power that this excluded theology had over the imaginations and the hearts of people all over Europe. It's really quite remarkable. So that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to supplement Kenneth Smith's work with some of that additional stuff. And in that spirit, the authentic Paul, and as much as these guys are able to separate him out, he does sound different from Sunday school Paul. He sounds different from Acts Paul. And it's interesting because the sorts of things he says are the sorts of things that really are inspiring. They're not sit down and shut up and do what we say, which is one of the points we're going to come to today, is authentic Paul definitely has the spirit of, it's you who I'm writing to who will decide whether or not you want to follow me. I can't make you follow me. I have to try to persuade using patho, the Greek art of persuasion. And that's very different from what the church is going to say 100 years later. 100 years later, they're going to be into the shut up and do what we say. And a few centuries later, it's shut up and do what we say, or we'll stick a sword in you or burn you at a stake. But in Paul's day, it's like, well, no, how could that possibly be true to the brotherhood of man? No, I'm just sharing with you my insights and hoping that they'll light you up the way they light me up. It's a very different voice. That's why I want to separate them. And I agree with what Stephen said. I don't know which of these are authentic. I can't even say for sure that Acts isn't authentic. Maybe Thessalonians is a forgery. He's right. We don't have direct eyewitness to any of this. And so the question is, when you don't have direct eyewitness, how do you decide what's real? That's why we're going to talk about a priori and a posteriori. I'm going to take about another 10 minutes here. I'm going to finish going through Paul's letters, and then I'm going to turn to a priori. So those 7 are the ones that most scholars think are probably authentic. Then we come to 2 disputed letters. And Burton Mack says most biblical scholars acknowledge that there are serious problems with thinking that either of these was written by Paul. There are problems on multiple levels. But in the case of 2 Thessalonians, there are 2 enormous problems. And one of them is 2 Thessalonians Xerox copies a bunch of 1 Thessalonians verbatim. And Paul doesn't do that in any of his other letters. He never just exactly word for word copies himself. And the reason is, this is one of the points that the Jesus Seminar people make in their book. Paul's not a Xerox kind of thinker. Paul is always aware of his audience. He thinks he's never writing to us, and he's never writing to all Christians. That's like a later invention. Other people do that later on. He's always writing to a specific congregation he personally knows. He converted them. He personally was among them. And one of the things that comes across in his letters is that he doesn't believe the written word is more important than face-to-face encounters. He believes the face-to-face encounter is the real thing. The community, the people sitting down together, sharing a meal, talking about their values, and thinking about how are we going to take care of each other and how are we going to change the world. He says that's the real Christianity from Paul's perspective. And he makes that clear in every authentic letter he writes. And one of the ways that he makes it clear is he only ever writes to those specific people about the things those specific people are concerned about from where they are at. He knows his audience. And he changes what he says, not in a deceitful way, but in an honest way, in an engaging way, in a personal, person-to-person, heart-to-heart way, so that he's addressing what they actually care about. And 2 Thessalonians doesn't do that. I mean, it's written at a different time. Even if it were Paul, it would be written at a different time, and the Thessalonians would have different concerns. So he would never have Xerox copied out of 1 Thessalonians into 2 Thessalonians. He would have done like he always does, which is to write specifically to what they're concerned about now. The other part is the parts that weren't copied, the theology has changed. It's not Paul's theology anymore. It's the later Pauline community's theology. There's things in 2 Thessalonians that are things that are going to become big deals later on, but they're not when Paul's alive. So why would Paul be writing that stuff? There's issues like this are how they start to tease this apart. Colossians has its issues too, which we'll get to later. So for those reasons, there are still some people who try to argue that they could be Paul under the right conditions. If we invent a bunch of stories about Paul and his life and things that happened and how he worked and blah, 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 then maybe we could still make them be Paul's letters retroactively. And you'll find a lot of arguments like that. But what they all share is they're all a priori reasoning, which is the kind that Kenneth Smith warns us against, which we're going to talk about today. A posteriori reasoning says the evidence just isn't present to think that these were written by Paul. The evidence is present to think this was written by a later Pauline community, people who followed Paul, who tried to be true to Paul, but had their own new concerns because of their changing times, and that those new concerns and changing times are reflected in these letters. And so it's not actually Paul. And it means they're not of no value. They're of value if we understand them as being what these later communities cared about. Then, then we can give them the value they're due, but not if we take them seriously that Paul actually said these things. Like anytime any of these pseudo letters talks about the fall of Jerusalem, or about how the Romans punished the Jews and the Jews had it coming and Christians hate Jews, all that stuff, that's all later. I mean, in Paul's time, Paul is a Jew. Paul doesn't see Christians and Jews as being in opposition to each other. I mean, as we saw last time when we were talking, he identifies himself very clearly, not just as a Jew, but as a specific Jew, with who's passionate and dedicated and cares and still follows Jewish law. So this is not a man who's going to say, "Man, I hate those Jews. Why are they always picking on us?" That's like saying, "Man, I hate me. Why am I always picking on me?" It's nonsensical. But it is the sort of thing a later community who's frustrated with, Judaism and Rome and so on might say, and try to pass off as Roman. The next group of letters that are not hardly anyone thinks they're Paul is the pastorals, Timothy 1, Timothy 2, and Titus. And these are the ones that have an enormous amount of misogyny in them. Almost everybody thinks these were written in the 2nd century, not the 1st century. The 2nd century was the big backlash against women. That was when the church was trying to strip women of their power in the church, make it be all men. It was trying to be more like Rome, because Rome was very patriarchal. And the early Christian movement at the time of Paul appears to have been mixed. They were, as Paul says, there's neither man nor woman in the kingdom of God, right? Those distinctions don't matter anymore. We are one people. We're all human beings together. And we're all trying to, as Stephen might say, we're trying to apocalyptically change the world to create the new kingdom of God that is coming. And that's far more important than who's a man and who's a woman and whatever Roman traditions are about how you're supposed to, hit your wife, whatever. That's not for us. That's for them. That's the old corrupt world that's passing away. But in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, they're right back to women should shut up and do what we say. And, they just don't. They sound so clearly not like Paul that Marcion, who's writing at the very beginning of the 2nd century, who's the first man to invent a canon, who's the man who coined the term the New Testament. In his first canon that he put together, he excluded all 3 of them. He said, not only aren't they Paul, it's obvious they're not Paul. So they don't sound like Paul. They don't have the theology of Paul. They don't have the warmth and humanity and the compassion to women as well as men that Paul has. Obviously, they're not Paul. And, it's absurd that somebody thought they could pass these off. Marcion was a scholar in his day. We'll get to him when the time comes. But the point is, you don't have to wait for 19th century German scholars to think this can't possibly be Paul. I mean, even within just a few decades of them being written, people are like, no, that's not Paul. Another pseudo-epigraphic one is Ephesians. Ephesians. Now, a lot of people in the early church were using Ephesians as one in their sermons and in their writings. So a lot of people thought it was, unlike the pastorals, a lot of people thought Ephesians were what could have been Paul's. But it's the 19th century Germans that tell us it isn't. They say the language and the style is almost identical to the first epistle of Clement, which was written after Paul died. It's whoever wrote 1 Clement probably wrote Ephesians. And if it wasn't him, then he had a community of writers that he trained, that group, and it came out of the same group. It has the same kinds of concerns. And again, this doesn't mean that it's not of interest to us, right? But it's of interest to us as a documentation of a later stage of Christianity, not the Pauline stage. This is post-Pauline. And then, this is my favorite of the bunch. I'll call on Donald in a second. I'm almost done with my list. We have an anonymous letter, Hebrews. It doesn't even say it's by Paul. Right? Timothy, Titus, all these others, they at least are Ephesians. They're at least claiming to be by Paul. Hebrews doesn't even say it's by Paul. What the hell is it doing in here with the Pauline epistles? I mean, it's an interesting document. It's probably written by a Pauline community, but why is everybody saying that it's Paul? Even in the 3rd century, Origen of Alexandria says, well, obviously Paul didn't write this. I mean, it's an important Christian document and we care about it, but he says, I don't understand why people keep saying it's another one of Paul's letters. It doesn't even say it is. It certainly doesn't sound like it is. So, and then there's a fragment from 140, a century before Origen is writing. It's called the Muratorian fragment, and it has lists of the Gospels and epistles, that might make up kind of what we might think of as Christian scripture. This is again long before there's a canon, but people are starting to think about what else is out there. What are all the choices that we have, and what should we be reading? It doesn't even mention Hebrews. It's not even on the list. It mentions all the rest, even the ones that it rejects, but it has no mention of Hebrews. So who wrote Hebrews? When did they do it? These are all open questions. What kind of theology is there in here? What stage of Christianity does it represent? These are interesting questions, but really nobody thinks that's Paul. Why don't I pause for questions? I'll do Donald and then Mikola. So Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, it seems like in the last few weeks to this week, we now have a presto changeo switcheroo. We were reading Paul and what he said about the early Christians, the I don't know. My notes are all messed up. Those, he three line thing you went over so many times. Anyway, that Christianity at that point is something within Judaism almost. Jesus is a Jew. This is the teaching of a Jew. The problem to be reconciled is how are the non-Jews to be brought in to this movement of Christianity within Judaism? And then 100 years later, it's how are we going to kill all these damn Jews? And what are they doing to our Christianity? It's a complete reversal to or not not exactly a reversal, but it's quite a change, is how Christianity works within Judaism to reconcile Gentiles to the Jewish law and to the Jewish God. And now it's, well, these Jews are corrupting us. I don't know. I mean, it's a fairly substantial change occurring here.
It's huge.
It's yeah. I spent a lot of time last week since you gave me the day off there to think about these things. Why are we spending so much time on early Christianity? And I think, and that kind of explains my comment that I just made, is if we don't know how it began, we will not understand the corruption that occurs with the medieval church, the Crusades, I don't know. There's just so much, the first, the litany of charges brought by Luther against the church, and then finally, and I sort of think Christianity ended with Kierkegaard, now, and I kind of think Kenneth thinks that too. The litany of charges that Kierkegaard brings against modern Christianity that says if you're not fed up with it by now, I don't know, I don't know what to do. And Kierkegaard is the same agenda of uncovering. I mean, he does a lot of other things, but he tries to uncover, to restore what Christianity in its beginnings would have been. And anyway, that's enough. But I'm just struck here is, Jesus, 3 weeks ago, it was, how can the Christians be reconciled, the Gentile Christians be reconciled with this movement within Judaism by a rabbi, Jesus, to now, gosh, how do we deal with these Jews that are just mucking us up? I don't know. You can, I'll be around for the rest of your discussions. So
I mean,
go
you put
ahead,
your finger on it, right?
and do but you can see we're starting a dialectic,
We are.
and if we don't get the beginning right, we won't get the dialectic right. And so we won't be able to properly vilify where this thing is.
Yeah.
We'll accuse it of some trivial mistake rather than a dialectical crash and collision or something.
Exactly. If it does some massive betrayal, but we don't know it because we don't know how it started and
Right.
what it actually
Exactly.
overthrew.
That's exactly the point. Without knowing the beginning, we won't understand how bad the end really was. It
Yes.
wasn't just that, we could have had a kinder, gentler medieval Christianity.
Yeah.
It's that no, they don't understand the faith. They don't understand the virtues. They've forgotten everything.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I mean, partially this whole getting into, the source materials is because Kenneth is making some bold claims in his chapters, in the medieval chapters of this book, about how much of a betrayal is taking place. And it's all well and good to take his word for it. But if we cite the sources, we're going to see that betrayal in action and in detail. And part of it is exactly what you're saying. I mean, here we are with the early Christians saying we're trying to form a community of Gentiles and Jews together. We see what the Jews have. We see that it has a remarkable solidarity and capacity to endure. And now we want to expand that to include other people. But by 100 years later, somehow we hate the Jews. The Jews killed Jesus, and now we want to kill the Jews. And how the hell do you get from here to there? Well, we're going to trace that. And part of the reason that we're tracing it the way we are is when you separate the probably spurious Paul from the probably authentic Paul, what we find is that the authentic Paul makes sense to be writing in 50. You can see a lot of connection between Paul's sense of community and theology on the one hand, and what we now have evidence for before him in Q, in Thomas, and in these pre-Pauline fragments that we went through together about a month ago. You can see that sense of the blessed community, the three-line thing that you alluded to, how do we justify bringing the Gentiles in? It's still in Paul, in the authentic Paul. It's just not always in the forged Paul. The forged Paul often says the opposite. And this is the kind of way that these biblical scholars can tease them apart and go, like Nietzsche the philologist, having spent the time immersed in genuine Paul, you get a feel for when the fake Paul comes along later on and pretends to be the original, but he still can't stop frothing at the mouth about Jews and women. And you're like, yeah, those are your fingerprints. That's not Paul. You can say you're Paul, but Paul would never have said that. The Paul that we see in these other 7 letters, he wouldn't have written those things. You know, Blessed are the groovy, for they will get down with their funky selves. I'm sorry, that is not Jesus. That's the 1960s and 70s, baby. I was there. It's like and not only is it wrong, it's even wrong to say, ask not what you could do for your funky country, but what your funky country could do for your groovy self. Even JFK wouldn't have said that. You can be off by even a decade, and the mismatch can be so stark that if you are well versed in both idioms, it just leaps out at you when somebody is saying things that just absolutely they would not have said that. That's the wrong era, you know. Even the jargon filled, James, yeah, who am I? James Brown. Even if we're talking Funkadelic and Parliament, you're still not going to see them saying gnarly, right? That's the 80s and 90s. Tubular, man. No, I'm sorry, James Brown didn't say tubular. It's like you can still separate the idiom and the jargon. And when you do, it becomes obvious that this line could not have been in the original letter. Mikele, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, by the way, Rick, Marshall. By the way, can I call you Marshall, Rick? By the way,
Call me whatever you like.
yes, thank you, Mark. By the way, Marshall, Rick, Marshall Rickier. I love that you call me Michiel or Michele. It's just because usually it's Michelle or Michelle, but I love that little zing with the pop that pops. Love it. But I'm thinking like what was I gonna say? Yes, my two things. You know who I think wrote Hebrews? I just came out. I was thinking about this a couple of days ago because it's been such a mystery for a long time. Like it's been debated. Um, I think Joseph wrote it. The father of Christ. I think the father of Jesus, Joseph, wrote it. You know why? Want to take a guess?
I can't guess. Tell me why.
What's Hebrews about? I'll lead you there. Let's see if you can be led there. What's Hebrews overarchingly about? What's the general context and drift?
We haven't done Hebrews yet in this group, so I can't.
Okay, so I'll just lay it out. So the overarching context and drift of Hebrews is about the transition from one covenant to the next. That there is going to be it's about that all foods are now made clean because the blood of Christ has made all foods clean. And he's cleansed and purified all things through his blood. And through his blood, all things are cleansed and purified. And so I think Joseph, the father of Christ, wrote it because when Mary told Joseph about the birth of Christ and that she was pregnant and what that truly meant, that they met when they left Jerusalem, he meditated on it and she meditated on it, which is why she wrote a book, the Gospel of Mary. Whether was written in her true hand, I don't know, but I'm sure she wrote a book. I'm sure Joseph wrote a book, more than one probably. And I think Hebrews, because hey, who doesn't like a good cup of Joe, especially one who brews one? He brews, and Joseph was a good Hebrew, so Hebrews the best book because Hebrew is a good book.
Nice.
And also, oh gee, oh yeah, I wrote you a message. Can you chat with me for a minute or two after the meeting, Rick?
Usually after the meeting, I have to go be silent for the rest of the day. This is very verbal for me. But if
Oh
you keep
gee,
coming back, we can exchange emails and stuff and
yeah,
talk offline.
yeah. Okay. Well, that's just my theory about who wrote. Oh yeah. By the way, guess what? So a little joke, but why? And maybe we'll talk about this. I don't know if this has been talked about too much, but like, how come where's the book written by Jesus? Where are the gospels written by Christ himself? Why didn't Christ write a gospel? Why? Because he was a carpenter with no hands. That's probably the greatest miracle of the whole book, and it's not even in there.
Yes. One of the things that we talked about a couple months ago is how prior to Paul's letters, we can see that there was a tradition of people collecting sayings gospels, where all they were here's some things I heard Jesus say. And different communities had different collections of sayings gospels, but they kind of sound like each other. You're hearing at least part of the voice of the real Jesus, it seems like, whether you're looking at the Q source, whether you're looking at Thomas, once you pull the Gnostic parts out, whether you're talking about the epistles of Peter, there were these sayings gospels that had Jesus's, as far as we can tell, things he actually said. And the one of the weirdest things that happens in the fourth century when they make the canon is they throw it all out. Oh, we don't need any of that stuff. We're not interested in what Jesus said. We're interested in the Gospels and the letters and Acts and in Revelations, but for some reason we don't care what Jesus had to say. We'll get there. We'll get to that part. But it's a fascinating. Speaking of what Donald was saying, the great Donaldius Maximus, if we're doing nicknames, his point is great that by the time you get 100 years later, there's this massive inversion in the focus of the church. It's just astonishing. It is astonishing that in the 40s, people so cherish Jesus's words that they write his words down and don't bother writing anything about his life. His words, they see him as this great teacher. At least some of them do. But by the 400s, they don't care about his words. They just throw all that stuff out. They're concerned about the apostolic succession and the authority of the bishops. And so they only keep the things that reinforce the notion that everybody ought to listen to what the bishops say because the bishops are in charge. It is an astonishing level of reversal. And of course, the point I want to make I'm about to call on Stephen, but the point I want to make before I do is to agree with Stephen and say, we don't actually know any of this for sure. This is all just attempting to make sense out of what evidence has survived. And the one thing that we do know for sure is that there's an enormous amount of evidence that did not survive because all these other writers are constantly referencing other churches, other groups, other theologies that we don't have now. We know they were there, but they're not now. But they didn't survive to us. And so that means the one thing we can be sure of is that we're missing a lot of the picture. And every attempt to reconstruct this we have is just going to be approximate. It has to be. And that means we have to approach all this with a certain humility. We can do our best to make sense of it, but we have to recognize that what we end up with is not the truth. It's just a possible model. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
It's a bit like Bart Ehrman. It sounds very good, but unfortunately, Bart Ehrman is very emotional. He's telling the story he likes, and he's not willing to challenge the story he likes. But I'd really like to get on to this juicy stuff you're going to tell us about a priori and all that. Because I think you made the offer about an hour ago, and we've gone down various avenues of Thessalonica,
I'm almost there.
I think we can skip the alley with the tarot readers.
Yes, yes. I've got one last bit, and it's very brief, and then we
Okay.
can start into a priori. And the last bit is this. You know, early Christian writings, the website points us at all these other documents that existed early on, most of which aren't in the canon. And we know now that some of the things that were excluded from the canon were the good stuff. Why don't we want to hear the sayings of Jesus? Why would we leave that out? If we were making a canon, that'd be the first thing we put in it. Here's some things that Jesus said. Here's some things that eyewitnesses to Jesus say he said. Shouldn't the book open with that? I mean, if we were making a canon, that's where we'd start. So we know this extra canonical stuff is interesting. We also know from reading some of it that some of it is batshit crazy. I mean, it's not just that it disagrees with the canon or disagrees with our expectations. Some of it is like in the Gospel of Peter, when they discover the tomb and that Jesus is not in it, the stone is rolled aside, and what comes out of the tomb is a cross that reaches to the heavens. It's the world's largest cross. It's a gigantic world-striding cross. It emerges from this little opening somehow. I don't know how, maybe on mushrooms and size doesn't matter. But once it comes out and it's towering to the heavens, it begins speaking. It makes announcements about what happened to Jesus and where he went. The talking cross, and it's not that it's not that I'm 100% certain that dragons and unicorns don't exist. It's that there comes a point where you're like, even people who wanted to put miracle stories into the stories of Jesus stuck with the level of walking on water and loaves and fishes and healing people. They mostly didn't have things defying physics and size and all that. It's astonishing. So it's one of the reasons why the Gospel of Peter was excluded from the canon is, the people who are putting the canon together, they said, I know you all, and by the way, this was a popular gospel. It was more popular than some of the four that made it in. Everybody was reading the Gospel of Peter. But the people putting the canon together just shook their heads and said, even we can't swallow this. This is a bridge too far. So the non-canonical stuff, you can't just assume that it's legit because it was excluded, and you can't just assume that it's not legit because it was excluded. There's cases of both, clearly. There's some of each. And it's possible that something like the Gospel of Peter, maybe the cross sequence is crazy and has been written up, but there could be other parts of the Gospel of Peter that are actually remembering something real, some other part, some discussion between Mary and Jesus, some discussion between, maybe Joseph has something to say, maybe Mary Magdalene has something to say. There could be other parts of the Gospel of Peter that are the only place where we have recorded genuine history from the time of Jesus. We don't know. It's like Stephen's saying, we weren't there to see it ourselves. We didn't videotape everything Jesus said and did, so we don't have that as a record to compare against all of these different accounts. We're sort of scratching our heads, and it gets us to the question which I'm going to end up talking about today, with the a priori versus a posteriori. But first, I just want to point out there are non-canonical letters attributed to Paul, like the epistle to the Laodiceans, the 3 Corinthians, and the epistle to the Alexandrians. Um, the Moratorian fragment, again from 140, which didn't mention Hebrews, even though it mentioned so many other things. It does mention the Laodiceans and Alexandrians, and it mentions them because lots of people are using them in their sermons. I mean, even serious Bible scholars of the time are using them in their sermons. And yet, the Moratorian fragment says these can't really be Paul. They're just as as is the case with some of the others, like the pastorals. It did not take people long to figure out that those two at least couldn't possibly be Paul. And biblical scholars have looked a lot at 3 Corinthians and concluded it can't be Paul either. I mean, anything's possible. But in terms of the science as we have it today, it's extraordinarily unlikely that any of these three are Paul. And there may be others out there as well. I mean, we know there are other letters he wrote. We don't know if they've survived, but there may be other letters that we have fragments of today that claim to be by Paul. And in each case, you have to look at them, you have to study them, you have to look at the body of evidence. You can't trust the canonizers to have told you what's real Paul and what's not real Paul, as we see from the walkthrough that we did today. And you can't trust anybody else to do it either. You just have to muddle through the hard way, gaining experience, learning about the art of how you evaluate whether something is in somebody's voice or not, whether it represents their character or not, whether it represents their theology and their times or not, and then just take your best guess. And then in the end, acknowledge that what you have is not certainty. Stephen's point is very important here. The result of all of this analysis and all this study and all this science cannot possibly be certainty. It's just a model. You just say, well, I hope we get more evidence, and I hope that that new evidence will help us make a better model than the one we have today. But with the evidence we have and the science we have, this is the best model we know how to make. One way that they do this evaluation is, it was only 150 years ago that people thought that there wasn't any way to do textual analysis on letters. They did textual analysis on the Gospels long before they did textual analysis on the letters. They're like, a gospel has a structure to it. You can analyze that structure and you can compare how different writers use that structure to figure out what their intentions are. What are they trying to say? But what kind of structure could a letter possibly have? Doesn't make sense. It's just a letter. And how do you know if it's legit or not? But then, this is one of the most important points about this. Studies of ancient papyruses in, like the Oxyrhynchus, where it was a big junk pile and people threw their old letters in, and they've been pulling the papyruses out, the fragments that are left, and putting them together and studying them and seeing what they say. Even though they're not biblical, they're from the same era, and they're looking at them going, well, what kinds of letters did people write to each other? And lo and behold, it turned out that letters did have a standard structure that they taught in school. When they taught you to write, they taught you how to write a letter, and they said these are the parts of a letter. Just like, when you first learn in elementary school, you have your salutation at the beginning, and at the end, you got to have your, conclude your signature block. Well, they had like 6 to 8 sections that were typically used in letters during the Greco-Roman age. And almost all of the letters out of the junk pile, no matter who wrote them, have this basic structure. And the papyrologist told this to the Bible scholars, and the Bible scholars said, what? And then they went and looked at Paul's letters and went, oh, these also have the same structure. I'll be damned. It's right there. It was right in front of us the whole time. We just didn't know. So all of a sudden, the epistles of Paul became amenable to literary criticism and study. And that has been what's been going on for the last 150 years. They've been looking at the standard structure of a letter. So with that in mind, I'm going to paste in for your later, enjoyment, three little things that are examples here for you to play with. We're not going to talk about them today. So I'm going to talk about the a prioris. But this is Paul's standard boilerplate for a letter. I've just put it into the chat to look at your leisure. If you pick up this book, The Authentic Letters of Paul, they'll also describe what the standard Greco-Roman boilerplate for a letter was, and they'll talk about how Paul changed that to update it for Christianity, and how each of the changes that he made were small but very meaningful to a Christian, like changing greetings to grace and peace as his opening. And they talk about why he did that, how he did that, and how it was a little pun. How the word grace is very close to the Greek word for greetings. He just pulled an I out, changed the tense, and suddenly it's grace. And Paul's like, hee. I'm both being true to the authentic letter, and also I'm getting a little Christianity in there. And of course, he adds peace because it's the Greek translation of shalom, which is a very Jewish kind of greeting. Well, next up, here is the structure of 1 Thessalonians. I have to do it. It's in two images. So here's the first image being uploaded, and then the second half is here. 1 Thessalonians part 2. So feel free to download those and look at them at your leisure, and you can see how what he has done is taken his standard boilerplate in the first image I shared with you, and he has heavily adapted it in the next two images I shared to fit what the Thessalonians are concerned about, to fit who they are, when they are, what they're worried about, what he talked about when he was with them, and so on. And what you're going to see is that each of the authentic letters of Paul does this. They never exactly follow the same structure. They build off the boilerplate, but then they highly personalize that structure so that it really fits the concerns of the people he's writing to. And one of the ways that they can separate out the ones that aren't authentic is they don't do that, right? They're generic letters. They're universal letters to nobody in particular. In other words, they're acting like some of the non-legitimate ones are just acting like circulars written to everybody. But Paul was always writing to somebody, and it was somebody he knew really well, including what they cared about. And he always adapted his complete structure to intensely personally go at that person or those people and what he knew they cared about. What they knew, he knew they knew cared about. I mean, it was one of those, it's like Stephen and I, Donald and I, Geneva and I, David and I, Donna and I, we've been on these calls together, Ari and I, Joe and I, we've been on these calls long enough that we can sort of, if Stephen's not on the call, then I can occasionally interject and say, well, what Stephen would say at this point is wouldn't Stephen be concerned about this that we haven't talked about yet? Or, Stephen might say the following, Donald might say that. We sort of know each other, right? Like watching Star Trek and getting to know Captain Kirk or Spock. And Paul always writes that way. He writes in a way in which you get to learn about the people he's writing to because he knows them so well and because he cares about their concerns, and he's writing to their concerns directly. This is what all the Paul scholars say. They call this warmth. He's got personal warmth. He's got empathy. He actually is interested in the people he's writing to, and he makes them a part of the way he thinks and talks in really interesting ways. All right, a priori versus, here we go, Stephen. A priori versus a posteriori. This is one of Kenneth Smith's most important concerns. A priori versus a posteriori. These are two modes of thought. They're different ways of thinking, and they're opposites. They function as opposites. A priori means from the beginning, or to the beginning. From the beginning, we'll just say from the beginning for the moment. And a posteriori is sort of, to afterward. And this has to do with how you reason. So deductive logic, in which you begin with a proposition, and from that you derive further truths according to the laws of logic, is a priori reasoning. Logic, deductive logic, is a priori. And the reason that this matters is that deductive logic works on the assumption that your premises are not screwed up. If your premises are correct, and if you have all of the correct premises that you need, you can then derive valuable truths from them. But a priori reasoning is very vulnerable to two things. If any of your premises is wrong or corrupted or broken in some way, then everything you derive from them is fruit of the poison tree. It's going to be broken too. You're going to take that brokenness with you. The laws of logic, of logical validity, can't screen out what's true. They're only determining what's valid, assuming that the propositions are correct. So the more you reason from a flawed premise, the more flaws you work into your thinking, into your conclusions. This is one of the vulnerabilities of a priori reasoning. The other massive vulnerability of a priori reasoning, which Kenneth Smith cares about a lot, is how do you know you have all the premises you need? Information out of context is noise. If you have only some of the premises, if you have 3 premises you're working from, but the actual issue demands 12 premises be taken into account, then you're missing 3/4 of the relevant context. And that context isn't present to correct misapprehensions. There are things that you can derive from the 3 that'll be false, that if you had the rest of the 12, they would correct you and prevent you from drawing that conclusion according to the laws of logic. But if they're not present, then the laws of logic can't stop you from deriving something that would be true if only these 3 premises were relevant, but isn't true considering the 9 that are missing. Incompleteness is a massive Achilles heel in a priori reasoning. And the reason that both of these things are dangerous for us is that we're mortals. To err is human, right? It is in our nature that we don't know everything. We don't have all of the context. All of our information is at least partly out of context. And furthermore, when we try to describe real things, first of all, we often misunderstand those things. So that even if we got a perfect description of our beliefs are off. But also, we often can't do a perfect description. Our languages are not perfect. Our ability to represent and describe things is not perfect. So even the act of putting a correct premise into language distorts it and changes it from the truth. Like this issue of, when we talked about last week, was Paul saying that God revealed Jesus to Paul? Or was Paul saying that God revealed Jesus through Paul? That is to say, did Paul have a vision in which God showed Jesus to Paul, which is the usual interpretation of that passage? But that interpretation is based on mistranslating the preposition from the Greek to say that it's to, and nobody translates it as to. It's translated as with or through, which means that he was actually saying it was through Paul. In other words, this isn't about a vision, it's about Paul realizing he has a mission. The mission is that he's going to travel the world and introduce people to Jesus, and God wants him to do that. The sentence takes on a completely different meaning depending on how you translate it. You're off down a completely different rabbit hole. In one of them, Paul has visions, and in the other one, Paul's got a mission. These are very different things to try to draw conclusions from. These are 2 very different premises. And they stem from the difficulties we have even putting a known truth into language, right? Let alone translating. So the thing about a priori reasoning is that a priori reasoning is something you can do from your armchair. It's very easy and comfortable once you learn the rules. It's difficult to learn the rules. Lots of people never learn logic or math. They remain innumerate or irrational, illogical. But if you can discipline yourself, if you've got the capacity, if you can develop what Hegel, calls Verstand, and what Kenneth Smith refers to as noesis, and I'll put those into the chat. Oops, no, only if I actually click in the chat, right? Verstand or noesis If you do the work, you put in the work, and you get trained, then it's fabulous. Now, armed with a set of premises, you can sit in the comfort of your own home and draw out massive, extensive, logic and conclusions from those premises. And you can make great claims, sweeping claims about the earth. You can say, all Democrats are evil, or you could say all Republicans are evil, or you could say all people are evil. And as long as you started with the right premise and you followed the rules of logic, you get to the conclusion that you want, which is one of the great things about logic. And when I say great, I have quotation marks around it. I hope you hear the quotation marks because, you know, logic is really great for, prejudice and discrimination, dealing with people in abstracto instead of, specifically concretely how they are. Because I don't have to know any black people to have a handful of premises about black people. And then I can start making sweeping generalizations about black people. And I can say, what? I used the rules of logic. Ipso facto, ergo, it must all be true. Right? What are you illogical? How dare you disagree with me? This is a priori reasoning. It loves abstractions. But what does Hegel tell us about abstractions? To abstract is to be in error, says Hegel. He says to abstract is to be in error. And why is it to be in error? Because it has an emptiness about it that excludes the juicy, meaty parts of reality. A priori reasoning is about not going out into the world and collecting any evidence. It's about me and my premises in the privacy of my bedroom doing things that maybe I shouldn't share with others. Maybe it's fine to do it by myself, to intellectually pleasure myself, but maybe it's rude and gross to take it out into the marketplace and do it. It has no place there. You know, this is Hegel's skeptical about Verstadt. He's skeptical about noesis. And he says we talk about this from the side of abstraction and the weaknesses of abstraction, but for Kenneth Smith's purposes today, we want to talk about it from the perspective of a priori. When you are operating in an a priori mode, you will not tolerate anyone challenging your premises. You will not. That's not an a priori thing to do, to let them be challenged. The a priori thing to do is to say my premises are sacred. This is where I began, and I'm preoccupied with where I began. Where I began is the truth, and you may not tell me it's not the truth. I'm going to circularly reason that what I assumed to be the truth is the truth. And now everything I derive logically, validly from those premises must, according to the laws of logic, also be true. And you can't stop me. It's my right to dictate terms to reality, me and my sacred premises and my rules of logic. So a classic example of a priori reasoning goes as follows. In Sunday school, I was taught a version of Paul's life according to Acts. I have spent my entire life believing Acts. Acts has always been part of my assumptions, my premises about the world. And you can't question it because I have it. It's mine. It's sacred to me. It's precious. It must be true. And the a priori way to talk about Acts and reason about Acts from that perspective is as follows. If someone presents me with evidence that's complementary to Acts or reinforces Acts, I'm going to take a keen interest. My mind wakes up. I light up. I like this. This makes my love of Acts richer and deeper. It's more interesting now. I'm going to add it to my Acts adjacent collection. I'm going to add it to my conception. This is Acts plus now. And that's okay. I can plus on Acts because that doesn't challenge Acts. And also, I've got buttressing. This is an argument against those people who don't like Acts. I love that because I don't ever want to give up Acts. So I'm going to keep buttressing and buttressing and buttressing. And every place that I can find evidence that seems to make Acts true, I'll collect that and remember it and think about it and reflect on it and obsess over it and write things about it and essay and give speeches about it and otherwise build up the labyrinth that I've constructed to protect Acts from criticism because a priori I accepted Acts. But when I see evidence that Acts is flawed or false, that's not interesting to me. I don't know why. It just bores me. Go talk to somebody else. I don't, it just slips off my mind. My mind just can't seem to grasp it. And if you force me to, if you sit me down in a conversation and shove at me evidence that Acts contradicts, say, Paul, Paul says, I converted a bunch of Gentiles. Acts says, no, he didn't. He converted a bunch of Jews. And you tell me, well, look, who do you believe? The guy talking about his own life or this thing written 40 years later? The one who loved Acts will say, I need to find some way to beat you. There must be some way, if I think about this right, that I can defend my premise and discard not only your argument, but your evidence. I need to make the evidence go away because I need to protect my premises. The premises were established a priori back in the beginning, and the beginning is sacred. The evidence coming from the world is a posteriori. It's after I established my ideology and my premises. And I don't want any evidence that undercuts my sacred premises. So the a priori person puts his thumbs on the scale and presses as hard as he can. He thinks, what if maybe the reason that the diction is different is because Paul didn't write the letters himself? Maybe he dictated them to a scribe. Maybe the scribe wrote a little differently than Paul did. Maybe, maybe that's what happened. And then the a priori reasoning is because that helps me defend the work that I like. Not only could it have happened, it did happen. It had to happen. Because if it happened, it protects my a priori premises. And I need to protect my a priori premises. That's my real goal. My real goal is to defend the premises and exclude contrary evidence and arguments. This is a priori reasoning, how it works. But a priori reasoning demands to be treated as scholarship. Right? I've got my thumb pressing on the scales of justice as hard as I can to make an unfair transaction. And at the same time, I refuse to let you look at my thumb, and I insist that you pretend that I'm not doing it. We must pretend that this is a reasonable interpretation, that I'm engaging in scholarship. A priori people reason this way. They're always trying to rescue or save the thing that they believed in the past from having to be overturned by new evidence in the present. This is the basis of science, is to dispute that. The whole basis of science is we're not gods. We cannot have a priori premises that are immune to corruption, that have no errors in them whatsoever. That's what gods have. Maybe Jesus could reason that way, but we can't reason that way. To err is human. We have to be humble. We have to acknowledge that our premises are probably there may be some truth in there, but they're also partially full of shit. Because we're human. We blunder. We have to always be alert to and search for, where are my blunders? Where have I gone wrong in the beginning? Which of my premises should I fix or throw out, depending on what the new evidence is that comes along? That is a posteriori reasoning. A posteriori reasoning says the beginning is not a sacred time, right? What's sacred is reality and nature and truth. And when those things disagree with me, I'm in the wrong, not them. And my job is to be alert, not for ways to defend what I already think, but to be alert for evidence that I've got something wrong, because that's a sacred opportunity. That is the sacred. This is what Socrates talks about when he says, you have to do justice to the rights of the question. Every opportunity to learn something new is sacred to beings that make mistakes as often as we do. We need to take those opportunities and say, ha, my chance to get one step further out of this fucking labyrinth that I'm in. I want to get closer to the truth and farther from my bullshit. And I do that by looking for evidence that I'm wrong. This is why science is all about, they call it falsifiability. I'm not looking to prove my theory. I'm looking to disprove my theory. I know it's just a theory. I know it's just a model. It's not God's own truth. So the question is not, is it perfect? That's laughable. The question is, where have I gone wrong and how do I find those errors? I'm trying to always falsify my beliefs. And if I can't, then okay, as far as I can tell, this is true so far. Maybe tomorrow we'll figure it out. Maybe tomorrow we'll spot the error, but today I can't spot it, so I'll stick with the model I've got. There's a reluctant acceptance that's part of a posteriori reasoning. You're always alert to what's out here, and you're always skeptical about what's in here. But in a priori reasoning, this is sacred. And that exists in order to distort it and warp it and make it reinforce this. And you see this in Bible scholarship. And we'll talk about how after I do all the questions. So Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, really quickly, I'll just say, it's an interesting, um, it's an interesting discussion in the sense that how we essentially have a limited ability to even look back and understand what we've experienced, right? So we create a story around the events in our lives. So then we use those same events to infer about the future. And so the distortion is self-reinforcing. So the idea of not of coming into a situation with no presuppositions is the appropriate way to actually approach and to learn something new. And that's essentially what Hegel, in a way, it works outside the system. It's in a sense that there are no presuppositions, and so that's critical when you're doing your assessing any type of new information that's actually coming in. So, I mean, this is really, you can kind of see this is the basis of bias and how our biases are baked in. And that is why also the more that we think we know, um, I would say the more likely we are open to failure, in the sense that, that we're allowing and again, I'm not saying that, we don't use experience or anything along those lines to infer about the future. But I am saying that we're limited in what we can infer. And so that limitation is really the most important part, by understanding that and the limitations around logical systems. And this is why paradoxes are so important to understand as well. And I think this is part of the basis of justice. So, I mean, it's you were just referencing some types of analysis that people will use in order to justify their beliefs about particular races. We can also say that this exists even when you're assessing, let's just say you're assessing somebody that you're mentoring versus someone else. The ability to be able to assess them both, appropriately and imply what they would do, and like, essentially you can look at a number of factors, but you're going to be biased and you have to somehow figure that out. But I would ask you, so how would Kenneth, in this sense, relate this to ethics? And that would be my question then. So that, what is the, knowing all this, which is just fact, these are facts, what would then Kenneth, how does this relate to Kenneth's, Kenneth's ethical, system, as well as its relationship to myth? Because myth is also telling us something deeper as well. And, but yeah, so those are my questions.
Well, dear God, Joe, what a loaded question. It's just so rich. We could we could spend so much time talking about it. In terms of myth, part of the problem is, how do you overcome the 7 plus or minus 2 problem? Right? Suppose that to reason accurately about something complicated, like let's say the ecosystem of butterflies in the Pacific Northwest. Let's say you need I have a spreadsheet. Let's say on average you need 232 dimensions of premises. If you had the right 232 premises, you could do it. You could reason out, where should you build a building? Where should you not build a building? If you absolutely have to build a building here, what kind of ecosystem do you need to recreate somewhere else to compensate for what you took away? How could you do a non-zero sum approach to expanding, human cities while not destroying the ecology. 232 premises, but we can only think of 7 plus or minus 2 at a time. And that's at our best. If we're tired or it's the afternoon or we're a little sloshed, we might be down to 3. And, I'm sure every one of us at some point has had the experience where we are barely awake and we're down to being able to handle one thing at a time,
That's right.
if we're lucky. And now we're supposed to turn this 232 dimensional problem down into a 3-dimensional problem. I mean, you see what happens with the Mercator projection. The only possible way you do that is to massively warp the truth. Just astonishing levels of distortion go into that. So part of where mythological explanations come in, and it's part of why most people can't write genuine myth, is that they find a way to encapsulate multiple dimensions into something seemingly simple. But the more you think about it, and scratch the surface, the more depth you find in it. And so this gives you a way to coil up large numbers of dimensions into a few small, pithy, juicy, chewy things. And you can gradually over time get the conceptual nutrition out of them, without being overwhelmed all at once by too many things to think about. And this is part of why he used to describe the role of Aristoi as being so essential to the success of a culture, because you got to take this complex world and find a way to encode it in a way people can think about. Aesop's fables teach us an
Right.
enormous amount about human character that if we had to write an essay about it, nobody would ever read it, first of all, but also it'd be too long. But here's the fox and
Right.
the grapes, right? And there's a bunch being revealed there if we think about the fox and the grapes. So mythological stuff. This is why
Yeah,
they're
it's interesting to think about it in those terms. It's like Aesop's fables are almost like the first attention engineering that was done, in the sense that they keep these kind of short and but deep stories. And I think you're right in the sense that myth has a way of compressing universal truths into something that is accessible, and then and that even conveying like the basis of logic and language and things along those lines, how all of that works can be compressed in a myth. And I mean, it's just something in the example of just even, and I was recently having a conversation about the idea of the subject-object relationship and how myth actually can depict so much with
yeah,
self-reference. But if you talked about self-reference in general, like, or base cases and how loops work within a program, I wouldn't listen. But I mean, so I mean, in any case, that's but that's one of those important things. But fundamentally, what is it? It's also revealing our limitations,
yes,
and those limitations are exactly what people don't necessarily that people that infer or put too much weight behind what they can infer about the world don't get.
right.
And so anyway, these self-reference models that exist within these myths are a way of communicating. It's like almost a shortcut of communicating our limits with knowledge itself. Anyway, I'll leave it at
Yeah,
that.
I'm with you, Joe. And this is stuff Kenneth cares an enormous amount about, because when he says it's all either escapist or existentialist, he's talking about this problem. He's saying that the issue is that the more we depend on a prioris,
Right.
the more we have to distance ourselves from reality, because reality has this ugly habit of smashing our beautiful theories with its ugly facts. And so if we have invested not in what's true, what's outside of our head, but have invested in our beautiful, beautiful ideas, the only way we can protect those ideas is to step back further and further from reality. Every time it threatens us or threatens our beautiful idea, it doesn't actually threaten us. We add another layer of insulation to separate it. And the result, this is how we build the labyrinth. is through the action of our noesis, of our Verstand. We separate our cherished premises further and further from reality so that they can't be tested, can't be challenged, can't be questioned. So that we have this firm foundation of something that would be true. Yeah, Kenneth, connoisseurial ad hominem, damn straight. All of this is that's exactly what all this is about. He's talking about the ad hominem. What kind of person thinks this way? Why do we think this way? What are the consequences of thinking this way? Kenneth is saying, why would you engage in a debate with someone who thinks this way? Because you think you're there to have a conversation, but they're there to protect their cherished, beautiful ideology. And so nothing that you or they say is going to be understood by the other. You're at cross purposes with each other. So the more you protect your ideologies and premises from being challenged, the more you escape from reality into the land of theory. And the advantage of the land of theory is everything works out correctly in the land of theory. All the numbers add up correctly, they all subtract correctly. It's all very tidy. It fits into a spreadsheet. You can run a country that way. But of course, you can run a country into the ground that way because even though the
Right.
spreadsheets are all clean and tidy, you've omitted enormous amounts of reality from your abstraction. And the conclusions that you're reaching would only be true in the escapist land of theory that all of your ideologies thrive in. There's this fundamental. We've talked about lossiness before. When you're translating from one framework to another in computer science, we're always concerned with does your new representation have all of the important parts of the old one? It can be different, but does it have a way of encoding them all? Because if it doesn't, and you do the encoding and you throw away the original, you now can't get back to the original. Whatever you didn't capture in your new encoding, if you try to go back to the original, you end up with something different from the original. It's missing some things. Your new encoding didn't represent those things, and there's no way to get back to them from where you are. Computer science is not, and I know Donald knows this problem. One of the fundamental problems we deal with is data structures and databases. We're always trying to represent parts of the real world. And the thing that drives us up the wall is even while we're doing it, we know our first version is missing some things because this is our first time ever trying to represent or model that thing. So, as good as we are, we're going to miss something. And the only real hope is that we stay on this project through multiple versions and we get a chance to learn what we're missing and then upgrade our model in response to new evidence from reality, to let evidence teach us where our model is wrong so that our model can get richer and better and closer to reality over time. This is existentialist philosophy. When we say existence precedes essence, we mean that the new a posteriori evidence from the real world takes priority over our beautiful a priori premises. We,
Right.
who's in charge? Who is to be the master? We say reality is to be the master, not my system of ideas. My system of ideas needs to follow and learn and do better in the future. And if I don't do that, if I'm not willing to do that, if I love my land of theory more than I love reality, then I end up in the thing Stephen is always trying to warn us about. We become rationalists. And rationalists love logic and math because it obeys. They love it
Right.
more than they love reality because reality is always giving us ugly facts that won't obey and don't fit our premises. And we don't like that. It interferes with our clean, simple, empowering ideological thinking to constantly be stubbing our toes on stupid, inconvenient facts. And it's why, Stephen is not a fan of rationalism. And this is why Kenneth doesn't like a priori reasoning.
Yeah, I never noticed that Stephen wasn't a fan of that, but it was no. In all seriousness, it's something that you said there was actually fantastic. I mean, and it was such a subtle thing, but basically, how it's not us that would be that we're worried about being harmed. It's like essentially that it's our ideas, and that distinction is so important because it's not you,
Yes.
it's the idea,
Yes.
and that's how you identify with the idea. And this is the problem with how we identify with the objects in the world,
Yes.
and our ideas are part of that because that's our identity, as opposed to, because we're not harming ourselves if we're actually looking for something that is true, right? So that's really that distinction is so key, because that is essentially where we can think about things, or we become attached to things that are not us.
Yes.
And so and and that becomes our purpose. And that can be really harmful.
Really harmful. Many of
It
the
can cause a
worst
lot of
things.
wars. Like it can cause, yeah. I mean, it's like, and it leads to scapegoating, and it leads to everything else that you could possibly imagine that's wrong in the world. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
It's great, Joe. And it's why I'm always trying to reinforce whenever Stephen goes after rationalism. I know a lot of people are like, oh, are you attacking human intelligence? Oh, no, are you attacking me? But I'm like, no, no, no. He's attacking a kind of cultishness that happens when
Sure.
people become so attached to their precious ideas that they're willing to disregard reality itself.
Sure.
And then they don't talk to you in good faith. They're always talking to try to win on behalf of their ideas rather than to try to find out together what's real. This is such a serious problem with logic that early 20th century, late 19th century logician Charles Peirce, one of the most important logicians who ever lived, he tried to invent a third branch of logic. In addition to inductive logic and deductive logic, he coined the term abductive logic.
Yeah.
And it's an attempt to coin the scientific method into logic and say that logical premises need to be tethered to reality through evidence. And the use of the evidence to modify your premises is abduction. And it was way, I mean, he had a school of people who were interested in it, but he got thrown under the bus by Bertrand Russell and other 20th century logicians who detested this idea, who were rationalists and escapists and did not want any part of abduction. And as a result, to this day, huge numbers of people have heard of deductive logic and inductive logic. Hardly anyone's heard of abductive logic, but it's exactly the antidote that we need to escape ultra rationalism, to escape a priori only thinking and allow the a posteriori back into our structures of logic. I'm going to call on Stephen because he's been waiting very patiently.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, no, you're great, Joe.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not against rational thought. I see it as it's a big, very important thing. Rudolf Steiner in his was making a point about Nietzsche's evolution of thought. People don't talk about this. They think, Nietzsche was Nietzsche from the word go. No, well, according to Rudolf Steiner, he spent a lifetime evolving his thought. And the one we think is Nietzsche is the one that appeared at the end. He pointed out that Nietzsche started out as an idealist and then he became a rationalist. And he makes this outstanding claim that what really cracked Nietzsche up was physics. That moment when he saw the rock in the lake and he came up with eternal return, what's existence to me? I'm this mental entity and I'm looking at nature and I thought I worshipped nature and suddenly I see a terror. I see this huge edifice, which is not me. Well, I suspect his eternal return was about Laplace's demon. The idea that we're all just atoms bouncing around in space, which was sort of the concept in the 19th century. That was the truth. We're just atoms bouncing around. And Nietzsche was quite horrified by that, is what Steiner seems to say. And that's where the later stuff came in, the will to power. How am I going to make myself powerful enough to stand against the universe? Because the universe is going to eat me. It's bigger than me. Now, it's funny, I'm at this lecture with our favourite rationalists. Michelle knows is one of our favourite rationalists is Les Allen. And Les Allen spends the entire lecture attacking metaphysics. You have to be a fool to believe in metaphysics. And another guy, Robert Bender, who, like Les, is a rather bright guy, metaphysics. I try to point out to them that if there's two pillars in rationalism, one of the pillars is metaphysics, because we're not talking about physics. We're not talking about science. Rationalism is full of metaphysical propositions, and I can't understand how they miss it. Do they really look over their own notes occasionally? I mean, we have values. Rationalism is about not just facts, it's about values. Can you justify values? Can you claim that you can't eat babies when you can eat babies? I mean, can't eat babies is a value. Can eat babies is a fact. It seems to have taken up, that positivist concept that we're going to get rid of metaphysics. Well, you can get rid of human culture and the humans along with it if you want, because none of them fit your picture. But yeah, you see my point that rational thought is something that very strongly entertains metaphysics. Rational thought merely argues that some propositions are valid and others are junk. But it doesn't say all the propositions, all the values are invalid. It claims some of them are. Now, in physics, in science, we can't take our values, stick them in a test tube and figure out what they are. We can't take the value that says you can't eat babies and throw that in a test tube and try and work out what's the physics of it. I'm just sort of amazed they don't notice this. It slips past them. They must be somewhere else. They must be off in the twilight zone of abstractions. That they've departed this reality. They're not checking it, checking reality. Yeah. It's what psychiatrists say. Have you been checking reality lately? It's like this current war in the Gulf. They got all these propositions, and none of which have anything to do with the American dollar. It's Israel manipulating America. It's Trump manipulating America. It's somebody else manipulating America. When you get a secret phone call from Saudi Arabia, which says, take care of the Iranians, you promised to protect us 50 years ago, they're trying to kill us. Well, if you don't keep up your side of the bargain, guess what we're going to do to the American dollar? That's not in the news, is it? Because the dollar has nothing to do with it. Anyway, that's enough of me. But yeah, I'd ask for some input that rationalism is built. One of the pillars of rationalism is metaphysics. You can be an atheist and have metaphysics. You don't have to believe in the supernatural to have metaphysics. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes. I'm just throwing a link in there to the article on abductive logic at Wikipedia for those who've never heard of it before. The Charles Peirce article is not a bad place to look to. Yeah, it's one of the things Stephen said is critically important here, which is, it's not that Kenneth is opposed to a priori reasoning. It's not that Stephen's opposed to rationalism. It's that they are meant to function as part of a larger system. And when you take them out of that larger system and make them the master, everything goes to shit. It's when you have logic and it's leashed to reality, it's a powerful tool when it's answerable to reality. right? Then you've got science, or at least natural philosophy. Now you're cooking. But if you just snip off the empirical part because you don't want your tidy ideas interfered with by ugly facts, now it's become a tyrant. All you had to do was remove the context of the dialectical struggle between gnosis and noesis. Just pull the gnosis out of the picture, leave yourself with strict noesis, and now noesis has turned from a blessing to a curse. This is I'm rephrasing what Stephen said, to kind of make the point more, because it's also what Kenneth's saying. A priori reasoning is incredibly valuable as a servant. It makes a dreadful master. You want a priori reasoning and a posteriori reasoning to be harnessed to each other in a dialogue. You need, I mean, it's why the pair of goats pulling Thor's chariot, why the pair of, there's always these pairs of animals, even in Parmenides, there's these pairs that pull your chariot. It's never just one, because if you only have the one, it always pulls you off to the side and you miss the mark, hamartia. The Greeks are trying to find ways, mythic ways, going back to Joseph's point. They're trying to find mythic ways to convey a very complex idea, which is that we don't arrive at the truth through one simple operation. We arrive at the truth through a complex dialogue and debate between the different faculties of the human mind, who can check each other and critique each other and point out the things that the other one is missing. But if we just ally ourselves to one of them as our master and poo-poo the other one as bad, we become half-wits. And the faculty that would have been a gift becomes a curse. Rationalism is a gift as a servant, it's a curse as a master. And that's what Charles Peirce is trying to do by introducing abductive logic. He's trying to fix logic so that it won't be such a curse. So that it'll go back to being a gift by being a servant of reality rather than trying to dictate terms to and escape from reality. Michelle, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, thank you, Marshall Rick, for allowing me this space and breadth of time to speak on the microphone. Stephen, some great analogies and comments you made, and I'd like to address those, if I may. And it is funny, quite hilarious, actually, that Marshall Rick, you said, now we're cooking, since Stephen Hickson's comment was baby eating analogy. So some questions come to mind about that, some things. Can we eat babies? Well, yeah, sure, we can eat babies. And but do all of us, or do any of us in this modern time, in these modern times, want or do eat babies? I know I can say that sure, I could eat a baby, could, not can, knowingly, but I could accidentally eat baby if some roasted baby was put in a stew, just a little bit of it, and the rest could be boar's meat and gravy, actual, boar gravy. And if I came to find that out and could prove it emphatically, I'd become a trillionaire in gold bullion in the settlement case. So now, do people eat babies? Well, do they eat them now? Maybe some Luciferian Satanists, like, that are literal about it. Who knows? Maybe in times past. Maybe the worshippers of the god Moloch would eat the babies sacrificed to Moloch. Who knows? I'm sure people have eaten babies. I mean, there's got to have been one baby eaten. Can we actually agree on that? Donald, you have a curious look on your face. Can you just raise your hand at me and say maybe if one baby's been eaten, probably in the whole history of mankind? Yes. So you're going yes. Okay. So like, yeah, if I ever found out that I ate a baby, roasted baby, I would be quite ticked off. I would be off put. Yes. But now here's a big question. If someone eats a baby knowingly, what should we do with that person? The most ardent of pacifists amongst us, will we then say they should definitely get the death penalty and maybe a beating before? Or do we let them just rot in a cell with no food? Or do we give them food every now and again, but not a lot? Definitely not roasted baby. um, but could, can, if, when, where, why, how, who, how many. These are all questions, but it's good questions, and I think Stephen raised a very good point. So thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Michelle. So a priori and a posteriori, we'll come to these a lot, but when we look at Bible scholarship, what we're going to find is that scholars are split into at least two camps, and one camp is absolutely determined that all Bible scholarship can only proceed a priori. You have to start by accepting the canon as correct. We begin with that as a premise. It's right. Because if it's not, it calls in too many questions for the a priorists. They have based their lives and their belief systems and their worldviews on an assumption. And now they need to defend that assumption. And so anytime, no matter how educated they are, no matter how smart they are, no matter how much evidence they have, their thumb is always on the scale to say, somehow, when we get to the end of this, it has to come out with the answer that I like. And that's the only kind of reasoning. That's good. That's valid reasoning. That's good reasoning. That's sound reasoning. But if it comes out to an answer I don't like, that's bad reasoning. That's poor reasoning. It's uneducated reasoning. This is like a priori, they've decided what the outcome is going to have to be. And the result is you can't get an honest discussion out of these people. Their thumb is always on the scale. If you read the Wikipedia article that I posted to the link to before about what 1 Thessalonians, but especially the one about the authorship of the Pauline epistles, you'll see that they're trying to take a neutral position of pretending that it's reasonable to pretend that Acts is every bit as good a witness to Paul's life as Paul himself. They're trying to not focus on the fact that Acts says things that Paul directly contradicts, and that Acts is written decades later, whereas Paul's writing at the time he did it. So one of these, from a historical perspective, is a vastly superior witness to the events being described. The other one is vastly inferior. But the Wikipedia article knows that a certain percentage of its readership are a priorists who cannot have Acts questioned. And as a result, they want to muddy the water whenever the difference between the two comes up. Just try to shift it out of the discussion, blur it away, wave your hands. It's a controversy. There's disputes. Not everybody agrees. They use this kind of language to try to paper over saying the thing that they don't want to say, which is, God himself could come down from heaven and say they're wrong. And some of them will say, well, then you're not God. Because a priori, the thing I believe is true. And nothing, no evidence will ever dissuade me. That's one version of Christianity. There's a lot of flavors of that version, but that's one version of Christianity. And Kenneth Smith has an enormous amount to say about that version of Christianity in chapter 9 and the other chapters in the medieval section. This is where his focus is on these people and how they reason and the genocidal religious empire that they created for 1,000 years in Europe. But he's well aware that there is a second Christianity. You have a posteriori Christians, and they are concerned with applying principles and values to whatever comes along, whatever we encounter in our life. And therefore, they have a dynamic, not a static relationship to their premises. They're willing, they're not only willing, they're eager for their concepts of spirituality to grow and change over time. They don't want to defend a priori assumptions. They need to be alive to what's actually happening in the world around them and to adjust their spirituality accordingly. And there's evidence of people like this going all the way back to the beginning, because here's Paul refusing to write a universal letter to all people in all times. And instead, he's insisting on being exquisitely sensitive to the actual human beings that he met with and talked with and argued with and debated with and hugged, right? And shared tears with. And now he's writing them a letter, but he's writing a letter to them specifically and not to anybody else in the whole world. The rest of us can read the letter, and we can do our best to understand the letter, but we'll understand the letter more clearly if we understand that it wasn't written for us. And it wasn't written to reinforce our version of theology or what we were taught in Sunday school. It was written for those Thessalonians who he met with, who he was concerned about, who had some worries, and he wanted to help them through those worries to understand that this brotherhood of man that we're trying to create together, it could really work. You don't have to be afraid. We could really do this. And that is a completely different way of reading 1 Thessalonians than reading it in order to try to prove what we learned in Sunday school. That's that's a priorism. This has to agree with what I already think versus let us, for the love of God, let the real Paul speak. If we want to hear from an actual early Christian, we have to stop treating him as a Rorschach test and projecting all our a priorisms on top of him, burying him in assumptions and premises. We have to actually just let him say what he has to say and think in his own terms without all the rest of the stuff from the Gospels and Acts and Revelations, without any of the other stuff. Just this is the first letter that we've got. Without any of the other stuff, what does he seem to be saying? And it's hard. It's why philology in the 19th century among the Germans was a rare art that took enormous amounts of experience and scholarship. It is so hard to strip away all of our assumptions and let the man speak. It's hard for us to do that. But that's a posteriori reasoning. You let the evidence in front of you. Yeah, and again, that goes back to Socrates. And as Stephen pointed out, justice is quite a spooky, loaded word. But that is what Socrates says, that we have a duty to the question. We have an obligation to the question. We have a duty to the question has rights. It has its own reality that is in some way sacred because it's part of nature. And that means we have a duty to respect the truth of it and to search for the truth of it and to take it as it actually is and not just use it as a way for us to reflexively self-express our a priori opinions and ideologies. It's a radical different approach to Bible scholarship. And it's why it took 1,900 years of European history before anybody started doing this. I mean, it's hard to do. It's hard to think. What if I'm wrong about a lot of things? That's a hard thing to say of yourself, but it's a philosophical thing to demand of yourself, isn't it? It's an heuristic thing. All of this gets back to Kenneth's stuff. So why don't we actually turn today from Thessalonians and a priori and a posteriori and from questions of authenticity? Why don't we turn back to chapter 9 and paragraphs 4 and 5? So I'm gonna, like I did last, we've got more time this week. Like I did last week, I'm gonna start by posting paragraphs 3, the sentences from paragraphs 3 and 4 again, just so that they're there for reference. Just so that they're there for reference to give us the context, because Kenneth is always writing in a flow. So the things that he's saying in paragraph 5 flow out of the things that he was saying in paragraphs 3 and 4. And this is where he's critiquing the a priorism of the way of certain dominant forms of spirituality within Christendom. He's saying, there are these differences between the people who are trying to get back to the spirit of Jesus on the one hand, versus the ones who could care less about that and are just trying to create a religious empire on the other. These are almost, you would almost, in any, if you were working in the land of theory, you would almost say these are two completely separate antagonistic religions. They ought to have different names. They ought to have, different, sacred people in their past. They ought to have different symbols. They ought to meet in different churches. But weirdly, they're using the same names for the opposite things. There is this way in which the a priorism demands, as he says in sentences 4 and 5 of paragraph 4, the a priori approach to Christianity, it has a stupefying effect. It says, we do not want you to be alive to what's happening around you. We want you to be obedient to the catechisms that we've programmed into you. We want to hear you say and see you do the things that are expected of you. And we don't want to hear you say the things that are forbidden or do the things that are forbidden or will, harm you to try to persuade you to stop it. And if you won't stop it, we'll kill you. It's not accept. This is why there's a genocidal element to medievalism in the 19th, not in the 19th century, but in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period. It has this quality of everybody must conform, everybody must comply. In a context like that, when your life is at stake, to be creative, to be alive to the truth, to have a radical essentialist education or character that's trying to get deep into making sense of things, if that's your nature, you're in danger. You got to learn to hold your mouth. You got to not say what you're thinking. You have to learn to separate the persona you project publicly, which is the one that's acceptable and doesn't get you killed, from the actual character that you are inside, which is to ask the kinds of questions that this medieval theology can't actually stand up to. And thus you become a threat to that theology, and thus they have to do you in, as happened to Giordano Bruno. This is what he's talking about here. There is a stupefying effect that happens when you have a character that wants to engage, wants to be alive, and when you have an empathy that makes you want to reach out to other people. But if you do, you'll die. So you learn to put a lid on it and nail it down and not let that real part of yourself come out on penalty of death. So he opens paragraph 5 by asking a question. What are the implications of founding a religion on a cult of faith or fideism? In other words, this a priorism. We know in advance what the answer is that better come out of your mouth. It has to be that. And he then, he's saying this is a different kind of religion than the religion of Jesus. And it's certainly a different kind of religion than the religion that we're seeing in the authentic Paul, who is highly alive to his congregation. The Jesus Seminar book that I talked about, the authentic letters of Paul, they make a big point of this. They say one of the big differences between the authentic Paul and the inauthentic Paul of later is that the inauthentic Paul of later is constantly handing down commandments as though he confused himself with God, which is something a Jew would never do. Right? The Jews are very clear on the difference between man and God. It's a centerpiece of the religion, of the different roles that people have. We don't get to issue commandments. We have to try to understand. But the Christian church in the second, third, and fourth centuries is trying to cozy up to the Roman Empire and become imperial, what do I want to say? Imperial compatible. And ultimately that leads to it being, when they succeed enough, that leads to it being adopted as the imperial religion. But that is a million miles away. Like Donald was saying, it's like the opposite of what Paul's talking about, where Paul cannot command. It's what the Jesus Seminar people are saying. Nowhere in the authentic letters does he command. He advises. He has, and now we're back to Kenneth Smith and Nietzsche. Like the Greek gods, he never says thou shalt. He has an avuncular relationship to his flocks. He's not paternalistic, demanding that they do things. He's paternalistic in an avuncular way. I have had some life experience that has taught me some things. If you don't want to get bit the way I got bit, try doing this instead of what I did. He's sharing his experience with people. He actually talks about them like they're his children and like he's their father in section 2 of 1 Thessalonians. But the kind of father that he's describing is not the later fire and brimstone father, obey or I kill you. It's the avuncular father of, you got to make up your own minds, but I care about you and I'm sharing with you my painful experience in the hopes that you can steer clear of it. So he continues, without knowing of or having to inform oneself within a dogmatic or fideist version of Christianity, one assures oneself that one already knows all that is essential, right? Your premises, your Sunday school training, that's all that's essential. Christian fideism, this variety of Christianity, is the degradation of Platonic a priorism, right? Because Plato was an Aristos. His approach to a priorism was still rich and eristic. which is a point Donald frequently makes with us. It's a point of disagreement that Donald has with Kenneth. Donald thinks that Kenneth pushes the argument about Plato and his a prioris a little farther than the evidence will bear, and that if you closely read the dialogues, you see plenty of evidence that not only does Plato deal in a priorisms, he also deals in a posteriori. He respects the a posteriori, but he respects it in a way that the later Christian Neoplatonism doesn't. It gets strictly a prioristic, and that's what Kenneth is critiquing here, and that's really why Kenneth calls Plato out like this. Is he's kind of being unfair to Plato. He's treating Plato in terms of what people did with Plato later, rather than with what Plato actually said. Which I can see why Donald wants to wants to champion Plato from time to time. Go maybe not slap Plato around quite that much. A slap or two fine, but maybe not that many slaps. Anyway, he says the evolutionarily or rationally retrograde collapse of philosophical culture into dogmatism. From philosophical culture to dogmatism. And we can see that in Q and in Thomas, can't we? In those sayings, we see a picture of a world in which Jesus is not telling you exactly what to do. Jesus is saying, Jesus got an apocalyptic mission, as Stephen likes to say, in which he's saying the world around us is not working anymore, and it hasn't been working for a long time. It's rotten. They broke up all of our temple states that were working, and they gave us nothing in return. They gave us the unlovable empire, the punch in the face empire. You can't love it. You can't belong to it. It wants you to obey, and it doesn't give a shit about anything beyond that. And that's not enough for human beings. And so we need something new. And Jesus posits the kingdom of God that's going to replace all of this mess. And the kingdom of God is gonna be the better world that we wish we lived in. That the world of the what Solomon at his best would have been, what David at his best would have been. Instead of these Tiberiuses, and Caligulas ruling us, we need to be ruled by wisdom, wisdom's child, as they called Jesus in one of the sayings, by the wisdom of Solomon, the wisdom of someone who understands and cares. And the way that we're going to move into that kingdom is not to wait for that king, but to begin treating each other right now as though we live in that kingdom already. And if we do that, then we are creating the kingdom here and now, and we are incrementally replacing the current world order. The apocalypse is now, and we're making it happen just by treating each other like we matter and like we care. And casting aside the things that the world around us values, because that's all part of this corrupt system. When instead we learn to value the things that Jesus values, that God values, the things that are worth valuing. And as we undergo that transvaluation of values, hello Nietzsche, as we do that, we actually transform into citizens of the kingdom of God that we're trying to create. So there is all this kind of at the core of the early Jesus sayings. And there are a few things more incompatible with the later dogmatism that Michelle was asking about. Are we going to talk about the Inquisition? We'll get there, but you don't even have to go to the Inquisition to get to the point where the church starts getting dogmatic and starts insisting that we don't want you alive to the world. We don't want your creative spirit engaged. We want you obedient. We'll tell you what to think and do, and then you think that and you do that. And that's what we want from you. This is what Kenneth is critiquing. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I also think Christian fideism corrupts Kenneth's wonderful patron saint Aristotle in much the same way. Just as they took the idea of the good and said, oh, well, that's really God. They took Aristotle's unmoved mover and said, oh, well, that's also God. So, even if you think Plato is an a priorist and Aristotle is an a posteriorist, fideism took, I don't want to say took, corrupted both in a similar fashion. You know, I mean, well, I mean that's more an observation, but I think it's pretty clear by the time, if you read, and I didn't read extensively, but I had to read a few works by Aquinas, that you see these arguments from the Greeks repeated, well, not repeated, you know, abused in the medieval theology. But I'm not a theologian. I'm not gonna argue the point, really. Just throw it out there.
We'll have plenty of time to explore that, won't we? Because we're going to talk about Augustine. We're going to get there. We'll talk about Augustine. We'll talk about Aquinas, and we'll talk about Luther. One of the points that the Jesus Seminar folks make in the authentic letters of Paul is that part of the difficulty of getting back to Paul's message isn't just that the Gospels come ahead of the epistles, although I've made that point extensively. And it's not just that we had Sunday school training before we ever read a single epistle of Paul and we project that onto it. It's not just that either. He says Augustine betrayed Paul. So Augustine turned Paul into a pretzel in order to get the theology out of Paul that Augustine needed. And he wrote works that were widely read, and they became the lens system through which everybody read Paul. So people couldn't read the authentic Paul. They could only read, leaving aside the question of forgeries, they couldn't read the authentic Paul. They could only read the Augustinian Paul for 1,000 years. And if that wasn't bad enough, then Martin Luther gets a hold of Paul. And of course, Martin Luther hates Augustine's Paul. And so he twists Paul into a new pretzel, a Protestant pretzel, to justify his own concept of sin and faith and redemption. And now 500 years of people, being marinating in the Lutheran Paul. You pick up the letter and you can't see the authentic Paul. You can only see Luther's Paul or Augustine's Paul or Aquinas's Paul or what have you. It is the human mind is an astonishing interpretive organ. And the Greeks gave us ways to understand that with their metaphors of the Procrustean bed and so forth, the labyrinth. Go ahead, Donald.
Oh, I was gonna say also that it's not unusual, even in mathematics or in science, that something precedes a posteriori or existential, and then when they think they've got it pretty well thought through, somebody with a mathematically sort of bent of mind will say, well, this part of quantum mechanics, we can axiomize it. That all the results, we can write 3 statements, and from that we can deduce everything we've learned empirically. And that happens. So this inductive, deductive, a priori, a posteriori can work as opposite sides of the same coin, and can get abused by careless, I don't know, maybe careless or malicious practitioners, but on both sides. The question is, are you paying attention to the method or to the truth?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this ease with which things can flip from a posteriori to a priori, we see it in the way that physics just can't resist calling things laws of nature. Haha, we've got you now, nature. You have to obey us. And it's like, oh, people need to obey laws. Nature obeys what it obeys. And our ability to describe those things that it obeys is, approximate at best. To mistake our model for a law is just the most fundamental mistake a mortal can make in trying to understand, what is the nature of human epistemology. Michelle, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I did have a point something to share that was so on point and apropos to what Stephen had said and what Donald had said and what you were saying, Marshall, Rick, or Rick. But it's lost to me at the moment. So I will say shalom, shalom to my good friend Ari. Thank you, Ari. Shalom, shalom, Shabbat, Shabbat, shalom. You are Jewish, right, Ari? By culture, by practice, yes? Can you nod your head, maybe? Yeah? Okay, good. I just making sure I didn't offend you. But it's this apropos knowledge, and the other part of it, juxtaposing that. Now I remember that I was going to say, just talking about it, because it's knowledge, right? Just talking to knowledge makes you think of knowledge, and what's in your head. Anyway, it's quite interesting subjects and something that I've been thinking about ever since I've learned about those concepts. But like this idea that Christ, Jesus, is coming to bring a new kingdom. And in what was it in John? I can't remember which book, but in Luke or John, he's coming to reign. He's saying he's an apocalyptic preacher. And in Luke, he's an apocalyptic preacher and coming to bring a new kingdom, coming to do away with the old system. And then in John, but like I've heard so many people say, well, he realized that his mission failed and had to be more about love. But what if his mission actually succeeded that he saw that his mission succeeded in a figurative manner? And that the kingdom really was established on earth to the degree that he wanted it to be established, and in the manner in which he wanted it to be established, that there would be equality for all men, women, and children, no matter what creed or color or race or nationality that they were, no matter what religious view they ascribed to, no matter what illness or sickness they had, because lepers were the lowest of the lowest class of citizens. Well, they had to be, because coming into contact with a leper could just spread that spread like wildfire. It was a horrible thing to be, but I mean, it just had to be that way. There's no other way around it with the plague like that. But like the book says that we are all kings and priests. And kings are the highest of the group. But to a certain degree, even though the Levites, which were the priests of the Jewish peoples and nation and culture, as Ari knows, and as we all know, had certain benefits and certain leisures that the common Jewish people didn't have. The common Jew didn't have. Now, but they had a more stringent kind of code of conduct that they had to follow. And not all the priests could enter the holiest of holy places, and only the high priest could enter that, and that was only on one day of the year, and he had to enter with a rope attached to him, because if he entered with any sin, bada bing boom, burned up to a crisp. Ashes to ashes, and dust to dust, and not these shall return. So, but Jesus's kingdom, I think, is all about equality. It's all and there are great rewards, great prizes, and that's what Jesus was all about. It was about love and unity, and unity, yeah.
There's a scene in Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country, early in the movie when they're sitting down to dinner with the Klingons, and they're all sweating bullets because they've never been this close to Klingons before. They don't know each other, they don't like each other, but it's a peace conference and they're trying to make nice. And they're having some awkward exchanges, and someone proposes a toast to Chancellor Gorkon of the Klingons for, working to usher in a new peace. And someone, and I think it's Scotty, after an awkward pause, goes, maybe just us sitting down together and treating each other like human, like people. This is like a little picture of that future already right here, just by doing this. And it gives them pause, and all of a sudden they're not awkward for a moment. They're all like, "Oh, yeah." And just, I never saw this before because I hadn't done the research, but now thinking about Jesus saying, how about we get together and we share meals and we treat each other like human beings? And in so doing, we begin to usher in the kingdom of God just in that moment by doing it, just by refusing to acknowledge the usual reasons to hurt each other and cheat each other. We are actually living in the future kingdom that we're trying to create. And now I see that the people who were writing The Undiscovered Country were thinking about that when they had Scotty make that line. And they all, even the Klingons, all go, "Oh, you just said something deep, man." Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, trying to figure out maybe the funnest way to describe some of these things. But in general, to start, I'm grateful to be here. Love the conversation, and I'm really, it's really a blast. And I just really enjoy everybody saying so many things. Try to give something small back. Uh, I think a lot of what like Steven is saying that there's this trap that we're all getting stuck in our models, and I want to some degree pretend to accuse this group of doing that right now. It's always good for a reality check, right? And so for me, one of the best reality checks is looking for evidence in different areas than the one I'm already looking in, because then it's like usually just too much confirmation bias. So I like to look. So one of the things for me, usually what's going on in neuroscience or other scaling laws or cool things like this. So neuroscience is really interesting. It uses different language for almost the exact same sort of system, and it makes sense that maybe this is just this type of epistemology that we're talking about, this a priori, and I can't pronounce the other one. The is posterior stuff is just a reflection
Posteriori.
is a reflection of what's going on. Thank you, Joe. It's a reflection of going on in our brains. To some degree, it's what our biology is, and it's really cool that here the biology is exactly saying some of this stuff, and it's really neat. And to some degree, it's very similar. In biology, we call it top down and bottom up in the nervous system, and essentially that top down is modeling from propositions, expectations, abstractions, and then the bottom up is looking into the world for evidence to see if that aligns. And in general, our brain is spending almost 9 times as much energy making the models as it is updating them. So this is true in the visual systems. So the visual systems is also one of the biggest systems that's different about humans and other animals. Is we have something like almost half of our brain is developed to abstract visually. And so it's interesting that here, to give a source, V.S. Ramachandran talks about that we have sometimes 10 times as much back projections into the optical stuff as we do coming in. And that's fancy speak for top down. The brain is signaling 10 times as much information, what it expects the eye to see. And then 1/10 of that information is actually what comes back up. And so this would be 10 times as much weighting on the a priori as to the evidencing. But it's really interesting. It's really cool. In the biology, it shows that this thing is happening where we're modeling, and then we're looking into the world for that. And in epistemology, it's like claims on knowledge. But I think in biology, it's something very similar. It's not necessarily making claims on knowledge as it's making claims on attention, which is very similar to how we think of knowledge, because knowledge you have to pay attention to. If you're not paying attention to it, it's not really right. So it gives a weight to that knowledge. It's just interesting these things match. So there's this idea by Kant. We didn't really talk about him, but I'm pretty sure he has something called an a priori structures of cognition, which is a very interesting twist on getting this a priori posteriori back in a loop. And again, it's this nice loop that I'm almost thinking existence or essence versus existence. And it's like it would seem to be in biology or in reality, humans have this limited way of looking at time, but time is more complex and confusing in reality. Again, so we model it the best we can. But it's this idea of whether we should model it ahead of time or then update it is really kind of like, does the law exist first and then things happen, or do things happen and it makes the law? And it's this weird idea in nature. It seems to be both at the same time, because you have this thing of emergence. And emergence is like an a priori thing, but it only happens from evidence that something actually happens in reality. So again, it's interesting how reality is even like physics gets even more confusing than we'd like it to be, at least when we really look at it. But these models seem to really work well. And again, to land nicely, that it's really cool that our biological systems really do reflect this. And if we're trying to see if we're just stuck in some bad models, metaphysical speculation in this group, it's nice to see that maybe we are still stuck in metaphysical speculation, but at least evidence from neuroscience seems to give some biological footprint to match up that this is how the brain, it seems to work with this top-down, bottom-up stuff, and that the brain weights that top-down, that a priori, way much. And it's very easy to get into a trap of just modeling and modeling and modeling. And I like there's a thing for Joe here that this is really specific to, that I think relates to in the idea of also being an existentialist versus an escapist, is I like the idea of how we're measuring the target. And when the measure becomes the target, it's no longer a measure. I think that's the way to phrase this whole trap. And the idea is we want to be very careful, because things like dopamine are measurements. They're how close we are on precision and how confident we are and how much they feel like they're important and we're motivated. But the target is very much about what are we updating our priors with? What are we looking into reality? Is the target really matching up to our measure? And we seem to be very biased against that. We don't want to look into reality and say, are our models matching up? But that's the key. And I think that's the trap. We all end up with these measures that become the target. And that's also the superpower of humans, I would say. It's like if I'm in the battlefield and all I'm going to do is follow my buddy's backpack, that's all I can track, the one thing, that's going to make me stay alive, right? So it cuts both ways. And I think the idea is just to be seeing it as a superpower that we should use sometimes. But this idea to abstract in order to make proxies, to reduce uncertainty and increase levels of precision is really, really great. But anytime we do that, it lessens our ability to see if we're still on target. And so you have to go back. So models are great and they're expensive to test, right? So this is the dialectic, right? Okay, I'm done. Thanks.
That's great, Ari. Thanks. It's right on. Well, we're at 6 after, so although we have lines of people with things to say, we also at some point have to wrap up so David can go home. So I'm inclined to say we won't be able to. We'll just have to end it here.
See everybody. Yeah, see everybody next week.
And yeah, we'll see you all next week. I hope you had a good time.
I was going to say, Joe, do I get to see you tonight?
Yes, I'm planning on it. So
okay, so if you have any thoughts on this, save it for later or write it down.
I will absolutely. I'll just, you have to look at the OODA loop, and we'll talk about plasticity, because of how the prevailing ideas around the brain itself, up until the point of understanding that how it can physically change, and that was rejected for the longest time. But the OODA loop is right up your alley. It's basically don't use the metrics to always make the decisions, and it was a survivability mechanism for a fighter pilot named John Boyd. And cool. Essentially, if you use the metrics, you're dead, because it becomes about the metrics and not about what you're actually the situation that you're in.
Now I want
so it's a survivability.
I want you to bring that.
I will definitely bring that. It is a really interesting loop, and it's actually. And it's also the basis for like even how certain automakers approach things. It was, and if you just really quickly, if you wanted to think about it, think about a company that really focuses on the metrics of a financial projection and gets away from the value that they were actually creating in the first place.
Yes.
And they're about the metrics and not about the value.
Yes.
So anyway, because it becomes expensive to update the model. Later.
Just remember, Anthropos rules.
Anthropos rules.
Yes.
Which is what this whole particular medieval thing is questioning, isn't it?
It is, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I'll see you all next week. Thank you so much.
See you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, Eric.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Joe. Bye, Rick.